Hi guys, tonight we begin a journey into the mysterious and often unsettling heart of one of the most complex civilizations in human history, the Aztec Empire. For the next 24 parts, I will guide you slowly through dark corridors of ancient justice, where laws were sacred, order was brutal, and punishment was a spectacle. These are not merely the customs of a long-dead people, but echoes of lives that once moved through sun-drenched plazas, feathered courts, and blood-slicked temples. We begin at the edge of the Great Lake, in a world where a man's sins were never hidden, and the gods demanded more than forgiveness. They demanded awe. Let us drift there now, together. The air was always heavy in Tenochtitlan. In the early mornings, it clung like a moist veil over the lake, thick with the scent of blooming water lilies, the faint iron of blood, and the breath of thousands of early risers sweeping their stoops, lighting cooking fires, chanting prayers to Tlaloc, the rain god. From the wide causeways to the smallest Chinampa island, the city hummed with ceremony. Beneath the noise, though, was a hum not from human mouths, but from deep within the bones of the earth, a sense that something vast was watching, weighing, waiting. Here, in this magnificent jewel at the heart of the Aztec world, the laws were not merely rules, but extensions of divine order. To break them was not just a civic failure, it was to disrupt the harmony between man and God. That belief birthed some of the most bizarre and exacting punishments ever devised, and each had a purpose, a sacred lesson, even if cloaked in horror. One such tale begins with a boy named Xochitlaca. He was perhaps 14 summers old, a lean child with clever hands and cleverer eyes. His parents sold obsidian blades at the market by the snake wall, and he had grown up among traders and talismans, learned the value of weight, shine, and secrecy. But clever boys often believe themselves invisible. One evening, as the last of the sun dipped behind the twin temples of Tlaloc and Huitzilopochtli, Xochitlaca slipped past the tiled stalls. He moved like a whisper, feet bare on the stones, hands twitching with anticipation. Beneath a merchant's stall that sold turquoise and crimson-dyed cotton, he saw what he desired, a small jade figurine, perhaps no taller than a hummingbird, shaped like the god Xipe Totec, a charm for fertility and renewal. In the stillness of the moment he reached, his fingers brushed the figurine. Then, an explosion of sound. The merchant had seen him. A cry went up, echoed by others. Traders surged, feathers ruffled, children pointed. Xochitlaca ran. But no one escaped the eyes of the Pochteca, the merchant guilds whose authority rivaled that of nobles. Within moments he was caught by thick arms and dragged into the open square. The crowd gathered like a storm. Xochitlaca wept, not for the pain to come, but for the shame. The Aztecs were not a people who merely scolded or fined. Every punishment was a performance, a message to the gods and to the people. Theft, even petty theft, especially when committed by a child old enough to be trained in Telpochcalli, the school for commoner boys, carried specific and terrifying consequences. He was dragged, not to a dungeon, for they had none, but to a public scaffold erected for humiliation. For an entire day he was made to stand, arms outstretched, with cactus thorns pressed into his skin. Children from the school passed by, forced to chant reminders of obedience. His parents, summoned in disgrace, were permitted to beat him with dried maguey spines, not out of anger but obligation. But that was not all. As the sun reached its zenith, the priests of Tezcatlipoca, god of judgment and reflection, approached. They painted his face with black stripes to symbolize smoke and shame, then led him to the temple steps, not for sacrifice, but for a lesser offering. There, in view of hundreds, his scalp was shaved in the style of a slave, a mark that would remain for moons. And yet, even this was mercy. For had Xochitlaca stolen in the sacred precincts, or from a priest, or repeated the crime, the punishment would have been death. A slow, ritual death where the body was offered in pieces, not simply as penalty, but to restore balance. But in his case, there was still a path back. If he proved himself, if he endured the looks, the whispers, the ritual purification, he might one day walk freely again. Might. Still, the mark remained. And so we drift now to another tale, one far darker. Not of a boy, but of a noblewoman. Her name was Atlacoya. Atlacoya's skin was like burnished maize, her eyes deep and solemn as temple wells. She was the third wife of a lord whose lands stretched from lake to Sierra. Her robes were dyed with cochineal so rich they seemed to bleed in the sun. But Atlacoya had secrets. and one day her secret was whispered by a slave who overheard too much. Adultery among the nobles was a crime so sacredly watched that even rumors sparked investigation. When she was brought before the Kalmakak priests, keepers of both education and law, she denied nothing. Her voice was clear, her head held high. The punishment was not to be death. No, that would be too merciful. Instead, Atlacoya was sentenced to what they called the Dance of the Bones. For 7 nights she was paraded through the noble quarters, dressed not in finery but in rags, and forced to carry the skeletal remains of ancestors on her back, figurines of jade and bone some centuries old, while flutes played discordant notes to unsettle the spirit. On the 8th day, she was taken to the temple of Xochiquetzal, goddess of beauty and desire, where her hair was shorn completely, her face painted white like a corpse. She was then given over to the servants of the poor quarter, where she would live out her days serving those she once scorned. There was no death, but there was no return either. She became a ghost in life. These punishments were not merely about cruelty. Each had layers: spiritual, symbolic, societal. They were crafted with the belief that to offend the world was to offend the gods, and to restore that balance, the soul had to be reshaped, often in fire. As we journey deeper into this world, the tales will only grow more strange, more tragic, and more fascinating. But for tonight, let the image of Atlacoya, once resplendent, now walking barefoot among market stalls, linger gently at the edge of your mind. Let the lake mist roll back in. Let the humming of prayers lull you to sleep. There were no straight lines in the way fate moved through Tenochtitlan. It curved and twisted like the canals that fed the city's veins, slipping quietly through shadows and ceremony. Long before the sun rose on stone courtyards and gilded temples, it crept through dreams and warnings, often arriving too late to change anything at all. In the early hours, when the stars still clung to the lake's surface like scattered maize, an old man walked along the edge of the Eagle's Causeway. His name was Quetzalcoatl, once a priest of modest station, now retired and forgotten by most. His back bent like the reeds in the wind. His hands shook with the memory of too many offerings, but his mind remained sharp, a blade dulled only at the edge, never at the core. He carried a bundle wrapped in deerskin, marked with ochre lines that no longer spoke to any living man. Inside, bone fragments from the femur of a traitor, taken during a punishment so old it had ceased to be spoken aloud. Quetzalcoatl had been there, young and afraid, when it happened. The man whose bones he now carried had been a tax collector. In the Aztec world, tribute was more than taxation. It was the lifeblood of empire. Every conquered town from the Gulf Coast to the high plateaus owed the Triple Alliance goods in precise amounts. Quetzal feathers, cacao beans, cotton, jade, gold, copper axes, slaves. The empire ran on these rivers of bounty, and the collectors were both feared and despised. Yohali, the collector in question, was of noble birth but greedy heart. He had been assigned to the southern valleys, where the air was thin and the villages poorer than their records claimed. Instead of offering clemency or adjusting the quotas, Yohali took what was owed, and then some. Families were broken apart, shrines stripped of copper. Fields left bare after the harvest carts rolled away. It was not until one of his guards, a youth from Texcoco, confessed at a festival of Tezcatlipoca amid the smoke of hallucinogenic herbs and drums that the priests heard of the crime. An inquiry followed, witnesses summoned, records checked. In the codices of tribute, discrepancies bloomed like fungus. The high priests grew silent. When Yohali returned for the next collection, he was met not by supplicants but by warriors. His punishment was a rare one, reserved only for those who stole not from men, but from gods. For in taking more than his share, he had upset the balance of divine offerings, cheated the spirits who feasted on smoke and blood. He was sentenced to the shaking earth. It was not a metaphor. A deep pit was dug in the central plaza, surrounded by masks of stone and adorned with banners in red and white. Yohali was placed at its center, lashed to a pole carved with the jaguar's claws. For 3 days, he stood exposed to sun and starlight, without food or water, as dancers stomped around him. Men trained in the warrior schools to leap and crash with such force that the ground itself trembled. The ritual was believed to draw the attention of Tlaltecutli, the monstrous earth deity. If the earth moved during those days, it was a sign the gods had accepted the correction. If it didn't, the punishment was extended, sometimes for weeks, until either the earth or the man broke. On the second morning, a tremor passed through the city. Whether natural or induced, none dared question it. Yohwali was cut down, but he was not freed. His body, wasted and ragged, was painted with crushed nightshade and his bones marked with obsidian. He would live, the priests said, but only in service to memory. One of his femurs was taken, cleaned, and kept by the temple of Tlakasipewalistli, used during purification rituals for future tribute collectors. Quetlashli had kept the second one, in secret, not out of defiance, but remembrance. And now, after decades, he carried it back to the lake, to let it sink into the silt below the water lilies, so that perhaps the soul tethered to it might finally find peace. But the bone was not the only relic from that time. In the slums by the southern causeway, a different punishment lived on, whispered by grandmothers and carved into the edges of children's dreams. It was called the flower cage. At first it sounded beautiful, but there was no beauty in it. Used only for those who betrayed kin, liars, deceivers, those who turned on their own clans in exchange for wealth or favour, this punishment was not merely physical. It was psychological, spiritual, communal. The condemned was placed inside a wooden structure shaped like a blossom with carved petals that opened upward and outward. The cage was not designed to restrain the body, but to expose it, to invite constant attention. The criminal was made to sit upright, day and night, while members of their own family circled them in ritual silence. For days, weeks, however long it took, no food was given by hand. If the criminal wished to eat, they had to beg, not from strangers, but from those they betrayed. Some were fed out of pity, others starved within reach of their mother's gaze. The symbolism was cruel and deliberate. As a flower, the person was once nurtured by family. Now they bloomed only in shame. One such man, Matlal, had betrayed his sister's husband to a rival noble over a dispute about land inheritance. His information had led to the man's execution. But truth bloomed, as it always did. And when the elders learned what had been done, they did not sentence him to death. Instead, they built the flower cage in front of the very house where he had grown up. His sister sat there every morning, grinding maize beside his prison, saying nothing. His nephews passed him carrying clay pots and firewood. Children spat at the base of the cage. He lasted 29 days before he tried to choke himself with a shard of dried gourd. They stopped him, not to save his life, but to prolong it. The cage remained another full moon cycle before they released his corpse to the vultures on the temple steps. Such punishments lived beyond the flesh. They carved themselves into community memory. They were passed not only through codices but through lullabies and cautionary tales. Even now they sleep in the stonework of Mexico's forgotten ruins, waiting to be stirred again. As the city bustled around him, Quetlashli released the bone into the lake. It sank without sound. Mist crept back over the water. Somewhere behind him a conch horn blew the first call of dawn. In the distance, bells marked the start of another punishment. The bells echoed like slow heartbeats across the city, resonating through the colonnades of temples and stirring the birds from their nests in the high walls. Their call was not a summoning of prayer or celebration. It was an announcement, an audible line drawn between the condemned and the living. In the central plaza, beneath the looming presence of the Templo Mayor, a crowd had begun to form in silence. Children clung to their mothers' shawls. Old men stood with heads bowed, and warriors in eagle and jaguar regalia watched from the periphery, unmoving. Everyone knew what the bells meant, and everyone, somewhere deep within, feared the day they might toll for them. Today's punishment was rare. Even the old priests had performed it only a handful of times. The condemned man's name was Tequilhuitzin. He had once been a scribe, a tlacuilo, whose hands had traced the deeds of warriors and the tribute owed by distant provinces. His paintings had adorned codices read only by high priests and rulers. But in the world of the Aztecs, the written word was not merely ink and colour. It was a mirror to the divine. To forge a codex was to lie to the gods. Tequilhuitzin had altered the numbers, just slightly, enough to conceal a debt, enough to protect a minor lord whose favour he sought. But the error had rippled. Tributes came short. A festival of Huitzilopochtli nearly faltered for lack of jaguar skins. The priesthood grew suspicious. The moment the discrepancy was discovered, the punishment was decided. He would undergo the riting of wind. In the days before the ritual, Tecuilhuitzin was stripped of his tools. His brushes, pigments, and bark paper manuscripts were burned before him. He was led to a small chamber beneath the temple, where he was made to sit, day after day, copying sacred texts from memory with his finger on a stone slab covered in ash. Each time he completed a scroll, it was wiped away by a priest. Nothing he wrote remained. His knowledge, once so treasured, was rendered meaningless. On the 7th day, he was brought into the plaza. A scroll was tied to his back, blank, save for the mark of shame, a blood-red spiral representing lies that spin inward. His arms were bound behind him with cords of twisted maize husk. He was then seated before a great slab of white obsidian and told to speak aloud every false word he had written, every number he had changed, every honor he had shaded with deceit. Each confession was followed by the sound of a flute, piercing, single, sorrowful. When he could speak no more, his mouth was sealed with a strip of rabbit hide. He would live, the priest said, but never write again. His hands, once revered, were painted black with charcoal, and he was given to the lowest caste, to live among waste collectors and canal dredgers. It was believed that to rob the gods of truth was to rob the self of voice. While Tecuilhuitzin was led away, hunched and broken beneath his silent scroll, another story unfolded in the quarter near the southern canals. There, in the district of potters and fishermen, a woman had committed a different sort of offence. Her name was Istamikawa. She had spoken against her mother. In many cultures, disrespect might be punished with scolding, perhaps a slap. But in the Aztec world, reverence for elders was not a moral suggestion. It was law. To curse a parent, especially a mother, was to defile the source of one's life. And that was no small thing in a society where birth itself was likened to war and the womb to a battlefield. Istamikawa had shouted in the street, her voice sharp and bitter. Witnesses said she called her mother a witch, accused her of hoarding food and casting spells to turn neighbours against her. The words spread faster than fire. Within hours, the matter was brought before a judge-priest. The sentence was delivered without delay. She would undergo the path of the cradle. It began with her being dressed in the white robes of a newborn, stitched crudely from unwashed cotton, marked with red dots for the blood of labour. Her hair was unbound and smeared with clay, her arms wrapped in cloth to mimic a swaddled infant. She was placed in a basket, not large but wide enough to sit cross-legged, and carried by 2 old women, one of whom was her mother. For 3 days she was taken from home to home, resting at each doorstep where mothers had lost children or where widows mourned sons. At each stop, women would speak blessings or curses depending on how they judged her spirit. Some wept. Others spat at her feet. Each night, she was left alone in a cradle made from reed and river mud, placed in the coldest part of the house. No fire was lit, no food was given. She was reborn, they said, but not into grace, into knowledge of the pain her words had caused. On the 4th day, her mother came, not with forgiveness, but with an earthen jar of maize gruel, laced with bitter herbs. She drank it without a word. Her sentence was over, but the memory would linger. The path of the cradle was meant to carve humility into the soul. Punishment in the Aztec Empire was not about revenge, it was restoration. A realignment of energy between person, family, city, and the gods. But the methods were often harrowing, forcing transgressors to carry their shame in their flesh, in their memories, in the stories whispered about them long after they vanished. And still the city moved. While one wept in darkness, another danced in festival. While one was cast down, another was lifted high on feathered platforms. Life in Tenochtitlan was balanced on ceremony, always spinning, always watching. Not far from the temple steps, a young boy named Tikpak-Xochitl listened to the bells, not with fear, but with wonder. He asked his grandmother why the man in the plaza wore a scroll on his back. She answered not with a warning, but a tale. And so another punishment became a story. And another story found its way into the marrow of the city, to be remembered or forgotten or dreamed again. The sun climbed slowly over the rooftops of Tenochtitlan, its light fractured by the thousands of polished obsidian tiles and shimmering canals that gave the city its ethereal glow. In the courtyards where children played with clay toys and women ground maize to the steady rhythm of stone against stone, life unfolded in rhythms as old as the gods themselves. But not all hearts beat to peace. In a quiet chamber near the House of Youths, a young girl named Tlapaltzin sat cross-legged, her hands shaking, her eyes wide and dry from hours without sleep. Her lips were stained with the juice of berries, not from hunger or mischief, but from ritual. She had disobeyed a priest. Among the Aztecs, disobedience to a priest was not just rebellion against a man. It was considered a fracture in the channel that connected the mortal world to the divine. Priests were vessels, conduits of will and word, and to ignore their command was to threaten the very harmony of the heavens, especially if the one defying the priest was marked for future service in the temple. Tlapaltzin had been one of the chosen, identified as a child whose dreams pulsed with omens, whose voice carried unnatural clarity in song. Her future had been fixed by the stars. She was to become a singer-priestess, one who would chant the histories, call the rain and speak with the flowers. But she had run. On the morning of her consecration, with her robes already dyed in the colours of Xochiquetzal, she had slipped away into the gardens of the nobles, where the air was heavy with perfume and laughter. There she had danced among strangers, drawn not to worship but to delight. She had tasted pulque, the fermented drink of the moon, and had laughed too loudly, too freely. A temple guard found her asleep beneath a rose tree. By sundown, her fate was sealed. Her punishment was to endure the hollow song. She was forbidden to speak for 13 days. No words, no hums, no whispers. Her mouth was bound with woven reeds during the day and covered with ash at night. She was made to watch the sacred singers perform without her, to stand among the choruses and feel the air pulse with chants she could not join. Each evening she was brought before a wall of smooth stone that reflected her image like a mirror. There she was made to gesture, with only her eyes and hands, the songs she would have sung. The priests watched. They judged not her memory, but her sorrow. On the final day she was led to the edge of the sacred lake, where the lilies grew thick and the air was always wet with secrets. A single priestess painted her lips with crushed cochineal and whispered a final warning, "Speak without wisdom again, and you shall speak never more." Her voice was returned, but its use came slower, gentler, as if the silence had taught her its own music. Elsewhere, in the district of stonecutters and masons, another punishment unfolded in secret, far from the eyes of the plaza or temple steps. It was a crime spoken of in hushed tones, for it touched on what the Aztecs called the vein of the house, a term used to describe betrayal within the very walls where one slept. A man named Ocelotzin had been found guilty of harming his own kin, his brother to be exact. Not with blade or fire, but with slow poison, brewed from herbs known only to those trained in the darker arts of the Tlachixki, the watchers and whisperers. The motive was land. Always land. Their father had died without declaring a clear heir. The brothers had lived side by side, each tilling separate plots of earth, but watching the boundaries with eyes that grew more narrow by the season. When Ocelotzin's brother began to weaken, his skin yellowing, his breath shallow, it was dismissed as disease. But one evening a neighbour saw Ocelotzin boil a tea alone, pour it into a shared jug and smile without warmth. The punishment for fratricide was not death, it was exile of the soul. Ocelotzin was sentenced to the Year of Echoes. He would not be sent away. Instead, he was to live in the same house, walk the same streets, but as a man invisible. No one was permitted to speak to him. No market would trade with him. Children were taught to avert their eyes. Every morning, his neighbours threw ashes at the entrance to his home, a sign of mourning for a man still breathing. Every night he placed a clay bowl of water at his doorway, hoping for forgiveness, hoping for someone to drink. But none did. To speak his name was to invoke misfortune. To show him kindness was to invite suspicion. And so he withered, not from hunger, but from the weight of being seen and not acknowledged. His footsteps echoed louder than others. His shadow, some said, grew thinner each week. When the year ended, a final ceremony was held at twilight. A small fire was lit on the roof of his home. The flames danced in silence, watched only by the priests and his mother, who had aged a decade in grief. A single flower, plucked from the chinampas, was left at his door. He left the city before dawn, wrapped in a cloak of ashes. The Year of Echoes was never performed lightly. It was said that only those whose crimes shook the soul of the household could be condemned to such vanishing, and though it left no scars on the body, its pain was one that echoed long after breath had stopped. Through all of this, the city thrived. Markets bustled, temples smoked, children were born under omens both dark and bright. But the tales of Tlapoltzin and Ocelotzin lingered, like scent in the folds of old robes. They were remembered not with hate or pity, but with a quiet reverence. Because in the Aztec world, punishment was not only a reckoning. It was a memory, carried like a talisman. And each memory reminded the people that the gods watched not from far above, but from within every stone, every heartbeat that dared to stray from harmony. In the northern quarter of Tenochtitlan, where the shadow of the Eagle Gate stretched long over narrow alleys and reed-roofed homes, lived a family whose name had once shimmered like gold. The Matlochitl clan had been builders, artisans of the highest order, entrusted with the construction of ceremonial altars, bridges of worship, and the sacred rain-catchers that adorned the temples of Tlaloc. Their bloodline had been praised in songs, but praise, like water, could slip through the fingers of pride. At the heart of this tale was an elder named Itzcoatl, not the emperor of old, but a humble craftsman who bore the same name. His beard had turned to frost, his hands curled with age, but his voice still carried the stern cadence of a man who had once ordered stone to sing. It was that voice that became his undoing. For among the Aztecs there were laws not only against theft, murder, or blasphemy, but against arrogance. Not arrogance in feeling, but in public word. To boast beyond one's station, to claim glory that belonged to the gods, or to mislead others about one's worth, was considered a direct offence to Maquiscoatl, the god of vanity and false honour. It was seen not as a private failing, but a social poison. Itzcoatl had begun to speak too freely. He would tell the younger builders that their work was weak, that in his day stone bent to his will. He mocked the new techniques introduced from the highlands, dismissed the architects of the newer temples, and even claimed that he had been the true mind behind the foundation stones of the Templo Mayor, a claim easily disproven by the sacred archives. At first, his neighbours laughed. Then they whispered. Then they reported. Itzcoatl was summoned to the Hall of Wind, a chamber where words were judged not for their poetry, but for their weight. The judges were silent as he spoke in his defence. He cited memories, lost friends, long-vanished tools, but pride had taken root too deep. He was found guilty of speaking above the sky. His punishment was the burden of the mirror. For a full cycle of the moon, Itzcoatl was made to wear a large obsidian disc on his chest, polished so finely it reflected his face wherever he turned. It hung from cords of yucca, biting into his shoulders with each step. The weight was not unbearable, but constant, forcing him to hunch slightly, to walk slower, to feel always the presence of his own gaze. The people were told not to greet him, only to nod in acknowledgement of his reflection. At each meal he had to sit before a mirror and eat in silence, watching himself chew, swallow, blink. The priests of Maquiscoatl said the punishment was designed to fold the pride inward, to make the boaster see the hollowness behind the words. By the end of the month, Itzcoatl no longer spoke unless addressed. He returned to his tools, not as a master, but as an assistant to his own grandchildren, who offered him quiet smiles and reverent patience. The mirror was removed in a ritual before dawn, and the reflection it once carried lived on only in his silence. In the same season, another punishment was prepared, but this one, darker still, involved no mirrors, no public procession, no chants or drums. It happened behind temple doors, where not even the wind was welcome. A merchant named Tequihua had committed the unthinkable. He had broken a market oath. Among the Aztec merchants, the Pochteca, there existed a bond so sacred it was signed not with ink, but with blood. Deals were not merely contracts, they were offerings. And truth in trade was not a courtesy, but a demand of the gods. When Tequihua, in secret and without witness, altered the weights used in his cacao trades, he was not just deceiving his customers, he was insulting Quetzalcoatl, patron of learning and commerce. The discovery came by accident. A travelling merchant from Tlaxcala, long at odds with the Mexica, exposed him during a tribute check. The local magistrates tested Tekiwa's tools and found them shaped in deceit, stones that weighed less than they claimed, balances fixed by hollow cores filled with sand. The market priest declared his soul imbalanced. His punishment was featherless descent. On the night of the next full moon, Tekiwa was taken to the top of the market's ceremonial tower, once reserved for honoured traders returning from long journeys. There, instead of being greeted with garlands and song, he was stripped of his robes and covered in a grey ash paste. His arms were bound with leather cords and his feet were left bare. One by one, feathers were removed from his garments and scattered to the wind. The symbolism was searing. Feathers were the sign of ascent, trade, movement, honour. To be made featherless was to be grounded, cursed to walk the earth as a liar. Then, slowly, carefully, he was made to walk back down the tower. Each step was marked with chants not of welcome but of shame. At the base, his tools were smashed before him, and he was handed a plain wooden bowl filled with stones. He would sell no more. He would carry. Tekiwa became a porter, a tlameme, bearing loads through the market he once ruled. His hands, once soft with calculation, grew calloused. His face, once lifted in trade, now looked only forward. It was said that years later he wept openly upon seeing a child measure flour with a balanced scale. These punishments, though wildly different in nature, shared one truth. The gods of the Mexica were not easily deceived, nor were the people. Truth was not a philosophical ideal. It was a living force, and those who broke it were not erased, but reshaped. In the city's south, where fishermen mended their nets in slow rhythm and smoke curled from the chimneys of bathhouses, stories like these passed gently from tongue to tongue, told not with scorn, but with a quiet caution. A warning. Do not lie to the stone, do not mock the wind, and never ever boast above the gods. The mist rolled in heavy from the lake that morning, wrapping the city in veils of white and grey, dulling even the shimmer of gold from the temple steps. Boats moved quietly through the canals, their oars pushing water with the rhythm of old secrets. Somewhere near the western quarter, the sound of wooden sandals on wet stone marked the approach of a procession, unannounced, unsung, but not unseen. In the lead was a figure draped in crimson cotton, not the deep red of war or sacrifice, but a softer hue, almost pink, reserved for shame. She walked barefoot, her hair unbound, dragging behind her a simple object, a worn clay pot wrapped in vines of thorn. Her name was Xilonin, a midwife. To understand her punishment, one must first understand the reverence the Aztecs gave to birth. Childbirth was war. A woman in labour was a warrior entering battle, and if she died delivering a child, her soul joined the spirits of the fallen, soaring east with the rising sun. Midwives, then, were more than caretakers. They were priestesses of the threshold, guardians of the door between life and death. Their every word, gesture, and breath held weight. To betray that trust was unthinkable. Xilonin had been found guilty of what the judges called the fracture of the umbilical oath. She had delivered a child in secret, beneath the canopy of her own home, for a woman who refused the temple's blessing. Worse, the child was malformed, born silent, never breathing. No rituals were performed, no offerings made. The body was hidden in the earth beneath a patch of marigolds. But the gods, ever watchful, see what the stone does not cover. When a travelling herb seller, searching for roots near the home, disturbed the grave and found the bones wrapped in cloth still wet with ritual oil, he reported it in fear. The temple matron was summoned. Xilonin was brought in chains. She confessed, not out of guilt but sorrow. The mother had begged her. The child, she said, was too weak. The signs had all been wrong. She tried to save what she could, but laws were not written for mercy. Her punishment was called the mourning path. For 13 days, Xilonin was made to walk the city with the pot that symbolized the lost life. Inside, ash and dried maize. Around the rim, the thorns of the tzompantli bush, drawn tight. With each step, the vines scraped her arms and calves. The people watched in silence. Some turned their eyes. Others wept. At the main square each night, she knelt, reciting the chants normally spoken during a child's birth, but in reverse, undoing, unweaving, returning the spirit to silence. On the final day, she walked into the temple gardens, placed the pot among the water lilies, and turned away without prayer. Her tools were buried, her name removed from the birth records. She would never guide another child into the world. And yet, in the alleys and shadows, her name was still whispered by women in pain. Not in mockery, but in hope. For many believed the gods had been too cruel and that somewhere beneath the lilies a forgotten child still bloomed. Far from the grief of midwives and silent infants, in the military quarters where drums never slept and sweat glistened on obsidian blades, another punishment took place. One not of sorrow, but of scorn. A warrior named Thenexcoatl, once a jaguar knight of high renown, had committed what his comrades called the wound of silence. He had abandoned his unit in battle, not fled, not surrendered. He had stood still when the charge was called. The battle was minor, a skirmish on the borderlands with a rebellious province that refused tribute. Thenexcoatl's unit, decorated and proud, was to strike from the left flank, but at the moment of the whistle, he froze. No wound, no fear, just stillness. Others surged past him. The tide of battle carried forward. The day was won, but his stillness had been seen. Among the Aztecs, bravery was a currency, cowardice a curse. He was brought before the Order of Eagle and Jaguar Knights, stripped of his regalia and sentenced to the dance without sound. At dusk, he was placed in the warrior's plaza, beneath the painted banner of Huitzilopochtli. Dressed in plain white cotton, he was made to perform the warrior's dance, alone, without drums, without chants, without song. Each motion had to be perfect. Every turn, every leap, every strike of the foot against stone. The silence magnified each breath, each stumble. This continued for 7 nights. The plaza filled with watchers, but no one spoke. Not a single child clapped. Not a bird cried above. Thenexcoatl danced as if to ghosts, his muscles trembling with exhaustion, his soul unravelling with shame. On the 8th night the drums returned, but he did not dance. Instead he knelt, and his hair was cut in the style of the novices. His spear, once marked with a serpent's eye, was broken across his knee and burned. He would fight again, but never as a jaguar. In the eyes of the people he was not dishonoured, he was humbled. That perhaps was the deeper intent, to remind even the strongest that courage must move, not just burn. As the city drifted towards sleep that night, the echoes of silent dances and thorn-bound steps faded into the hush of reed flutes and distant thunder. The people carried these stories, tucked behind their ribs, shared beside fires and whispered into the ears of restless children. Each punishment, a stone on the path of memory. Each memory, a thread in the great woven cloth of the gods. The rains had not yet come, and the earth, once soft and fragrant with the scent of wet maize, had begun to crack beneath the sun's unrelenting stare. Farmers looked skyward, their brows furrowed not with fear but with calculation. Offerings had been made, altars smoked daily. Still, the sky remained dry. In such seasons, every transgression felt heavier, every fault magnified by the gods' silence. In the village of Popotlan, not far from the edge of Lake Texcoco, a man named Chikawa was brought before the local magistrate. His crime was rare, but not unknown. He had taken food during a famine, not from the market, nor from a neighbour, but from a communal storehouse built for the elderly and orphaned. He had stolen the gods' grain. To steal from one's kin was a wound. To steal from the weak was a curse. But to steal from the collective stores of the people, especially during lean months, was to invite the eye of Tonacatacutli, the provider deity, and awaken the slow-burning fury of the ancestors. Chikawa's punishment was called the hunger reversal. The ceremony began before dawn. He was brought to the center of the plaza, where a shallow pit had been dug and lined with dried maize husks. He was made to kneel within it, facing east. Before him, a single ear of maize was placed on a clay plate, its kernels dyed black with ash. Surrounding him, seated in silence, were the village's elders, many of whom had gone hungry the day his theft was discovered. He was not starved. That would have been simple. Instead, he was fed 3 times daily with the same food he had stolen. Only that. Only maize gruel, sour tamales, and dried beans. Always from the same store, always measured, always watched. And each time he ate, he was required to chant, "This is not mine, I give it back." The words became dry on his tongue like dust. By the 10th day, he wept as he swallowed. By the 20th, he trembled at the sight of food. By the 30th, he could no longer eat at all without vomiting. When the rains finally returned, as they always did, he was released, not with celebration, but with a ritual burial of the bowl he had used. It was placed deep in the ground, beneath the roots of a young sapote tree. A new earthen jar was set in the storehouse, marked with his name. From that season on, Shikawa became a guardian of the granaries, appointed by the very elders he had once wronged. No one ever questioned his devotion again. Meanwhile, back in Tenochtitlan, the city's great market at Tlatelolco buzzed with traders, gossip, and the scent of salt and roasted cacao. Yet beneath this daily tide of commerce, another kind of judgment was being prepared, one that unfolded not in shadow or secrecy, but beneath the gaze of thousands. A woman named Sitlalin had cursed the moon. It happened during an eclipse. The people had gathered to offer song and sacrifice, for eclipses were dangerous moments, signs that the gods were fighting, that balance hung by a single strand of cotton. As priests chanted and nobles sprinkled obsidian dust into fire, Sitlalin, a cloth dyer, raised her voice above them all. "Why should the gods always hunger?" she shouted. "Why must the moon always bleed for their war?" The crowd froze. The chants faltered. The fire hissed. Such a question was not debate. It was heresy. She was seized, bound not by guards, but by the people themselves, carried to the priesthood like a bundle of reeds. Her fate was debated all night under flickering torchlight. Some called for blood, others urged for silence. In the end, the priests of Coyolxauhqui, goddess of the moon and vengeance, crafted a punishment they believed would both cleanse and preserve. Sitlalin would undergo the silver silence. At the next full moon, she was brought to the top of the lunar shrine, dressed not in chains or rags, but in fine cotton dyed silver and blue. Her face was painted with powdered pearl, her eyes lined in obsidian coal. She was then placed in a large clay chamber shaped like the moon, where the light could filter in through a single slit in the wall. There she would remain for one full lunar cycle, 28 days without sound, no words, no song, no response. Each night, temple attendants left food and water through a stone chute, never speaking, never meeting her gaze. She was not to pray aloud, nor cry out. If she did, it would mean the moon had not forgiven her. They say she whispered to herself on the 7th night. They say she sobbed into her hands on the 13th. But by the 20th, her silence was complete. When the moon returned in fullness, the chamber was opened. She emerged pale, eyes wide, lips pressed shut. She knelt before the goddess's image and placed a length of silver thread upon the altar. Sitlalin returned to her dye shop. Her hands still worked, but her voice was never heard in the market again. The people did not avoid her. They watched her with reverence, some with pity. Others claimed she had seen something no one else could, that the moon had indeed spoken back, not in wrath, but in sorrow. In the Aztec world, punishment was not always thunder and pain. Sometimes it was silence. A silence so deep it echoed in the skin, in the marrow, in the songs not sung, and in that silence even the gods paused to listen. The rains had not yet come, and the earth, once soft and fragrant with the scent of wet maize, had begun to crack beneath the sun's unrelenting stare. Farmers looked skyward, their brows furrowed not with fear but with calculation. Offerings had been made, altars smoked daily. Still, the sky remained dry. In such seasons, every transgression felt heavier, every fault magnified by the gods' silence. In the village of Popotlan, not far from the edge of Lake Texcoco, a man named Chikawa was brought before the local magistrate. His crime was rare but not unknown. He had taken food during a famine, not from the market, nor from a neighbour, but from a communal storehouse built for the elderly and orphaned. He had stolen the gods' grain. To steal from one's kin was a wound. To steal from the weak was a curse. But to steal from the collective stores of the people, especially during lean months, was to invite the eye of Tonacatacutli, the provider deity, and awaken the slow-burning fury of the ancestors. Chikawa's punishment was called the hunger reversal. The ceremony began before dawn. He was brought to the center of the plaza, where a shallow pit had been dug and lined with dried maize husks. He was made to kneel within it, facing east. Before him, a single ear of maize was placed on a clay plate, its kernels dyed black with ash. Surrounding him, seated in silence, were the village's elders, many of whom had gone hungry the day his theft was discovered. He was not starved. That would have been simple. Instead, he was fed, 3 times daily, with the same food he had stolen. Only that. Only maize gruel, sour tamales, and dried beans. Always from the same store, always measured, always watched. And each time he ate, he was required to chant, "This is not mine. I give it back." The words became dry on his tongue, like dust. By the 10th day, he wept as he swallowed. By the 20th, he trembled at the sight of food. By the 30th, he could no longer eat at all without vomiting. When the rains finally returned, as they always did, he was released, not with celebration, but with a ritual burial of the bowl he had used. It was placed deep in the ground, beneath the roots of a young sapote tree. A new earthen jar was set in the storehouse, marked with his name. From that season on, Chikawa became a guardian of the granaries, appointed by the very elders he had once wronged. No one ever questioned his devotion again. Meanwhile, back in Tenochtitlan, the city's great market at Tlatelolco buzzed with traders, gossip, and the scent of salt and roasted cacao. Yet beneath this daily tide of commerce, another kind of judgment was being prepared, one that unfolded not in shadow or secrecy, but beneath the gaze of thousands. A woman named Sitlalin had cursed the moon. It happened during an eclipse. The people had gathered to offer song and sacrifice, for eclipses were dangerous moments, signs that the gods were fighting, that balance hung by a single strand of cotton. As priests chanted and nobles sprinkled obsidian dust into fire, Sitlalin, a cloth dyer, raised her voice above them all. "Why should the gods always hunger?" she shouted. "Why must the moon always bleed for their war?" The crowd froze. The chants faltered. The fire hissed. Such a question was not debate. It was heresy. She was seized, bound not by guards but by the people themselves, carried to the priesthood like a bundle of reeds. Her fate was debated all night under flickering torchlight. Some called for blood, others urged for silence. In the end, the priests of Coyolxauhqui, goddess of the moon and vengeance, crafted a punishment they believed would both cleanse and preserve. Sitlalin would undergo the silver silence. At the next full moon, she was brought to the top of the lunar shrine, dressed not in chains or rags, but in fine cotton dyed silver and blue. Her face was painted with powdered pearl, her eyes lined in obsidian coal. She was then placed in a large clay chamber shaped like the moon, where the light could filter in through a single slit in the wall. There she would remain for one full lunar cycle, 28 days without sound. No words, no song, no response. Each night, temple attendants left food and water through a stone chute, never speaking, never meeting her gaze. She was not to pray aloud, nor cry out. If she did, it would mean the moon had not forgiven her. They say she whispered to herself on the 7th night. They say she sobbed into her hands on the 13th. But by the 20th, her silence was complete. When the moon returned in fullness, the chamber was opened. She emerged pale, eyes wide, lips pressed shut. She knelt before the goddess's image and placed a length of silver thread upon the altar. Sitlalin returned to her dye shop. Her hands still worked, but her voice was never heard in the market again. The people did not avoid her. They watched her with reverence, some with pity. Others claimed she had seen something no one else could, that the moon had indeed spoken back, not in wrath, but in sorrow. In the Aztec world, punishment was not always thunder and pain. Sometimes it was silence. A silence so deep it echoed in the skin, in the marrow, in the songs not sung, and in that silence, even the gods paused to listen. The city breathed in layers, stone over soil, smoke over incense, silence over noise. Beneath its beauty and bustle, Tenochtitlan carried a rhythm deeper than drums, older than pyramids, echoing from the very bones of its founders. This rhythm governed not just the harvest, the rituals, the festivals, but also the reckonings. And reckoning, like the seasons, never delayed. On a warm evening, thick with the scent of crushed marigold and burning copal, a young boy named Quali was brought before the House of Youths. He was no more than 10 reigns old, still bearing the plump cheeks and wide eyes of a child, but the weight he carried that night was one no boy should bear. His hands trembled, but not from fear, from shame. Quali had struck his father, not in self-defense, not in secret, but openly in the family home, during a disagreement over a stone carving he had broken while playing. The blow had been light, but it had landed. Witnessed by his mother, by his neighbours, by his younger sister, who would not stop crying even long after silence returned. To strike one's parent was a rupture in the sacred chain of order. In the Aztec cosmos, hierarchy was divine. The family was not just a household, but a reflection of the universe. Father as sun, mother as moon, children as stars that must follow in orbit. Kwali had broken that dance. The elders did not delay. They invoked a punishment known as the roots of the tree. That night, Kwali was taken to a small grove behind the temple school, where 4 trees grew in perfect symmetry, one for each direction, each planted by hands long buried. In the centre, a stone seat had been placed, low and cold, carved with the symbol of Ehekatl, the wind god who teaches obedience through gentle breath. Kwali was made to sit, barefoot, arms wrapped around his knees. His father, in ritual garments of linen and beads, sat opposite him, silent. The priests did not scold. They waited. They watched. For 4 days and nights, Kwali remained in the grove. He was fed little, watered only enough to endure. Each evening, a candle was placed before him, and he was told to speak to it as if it were his father. Not in apology, but in understanding. He did, at first through tears, then through questions, finally through whispers of regret that softened his voice into something almost unrecognizable. On the 5th morning, his father approached him and gently marked his forehead with ground cocoa and river ash, a symbol of renewal. Kwali was released, and though his punishment had left no bruise or scar, his steps were forever slower, more careful. He returned to his studies and in time became a respected speaker of laws. But he never again raised his hand in anger. And far across the city, where the palace gardens bloomed with flowers cultivated only for nobles and hummingbirds fed from hand-carved feeders, a different kind of punishment ripened, one crafted not for violence, but for vanity. A noble youth named Yohuali had taken a sacred mask from the temple of Tezcatlipoca. It was not theft in the ordinary sense. The mask, made of turquoise and jet, had not been stolen to be sold or hidden. He had worn it, during a feast. He had danced with it upon his face, laughing, drinking pulque, surrounded by other sons of the nobility who clapped and cheered. The mask had once been worn only during ceremonies of reflection, where priests contemplated the jaguar-shadowed god who could see the truth in men's hearts. To mock it was to call truth a joke. His punishment was not immediate. The priests waited until the next new moon, when the god's gaze was darkest, and then summoned him without pageantry. He was told to prepare for the mirror walk. Yohuali was stripped of his noble robes and dressed in plain linen. His face was left bare, his hair cut in uneven tufts. Around his neck was placed a circle of mirrors, small obsidian shards strung together, hanging down over his chest. Then, for 7 days, he was made to walk the noble's quarter in silence. Each mirror reflected the faces of those he passed, friends, rivals, family, servants. He could see their eyes watching him, judging him, wondering whether to laugh or to pity. He was not beaten, not shouted at, just watched. And each reflection pierced more deeply than any blade. By the end, he asked to return the mask himself. He brought it back, wrapped in fine cotton, knelt at the temple steps and laid his own blood beside it, cut from the tip of his tongue, a mark of sincerity. He was not barred from court, but he was no longer invited to the feasts. His jokes were met with quiet. His steps became slower, less boastful. In time, he would go on to fund the building of a new shrine to Tezcatlipoca, one with no mask, only a single polished black stone where the faithful could gaze into their own reflection. From the smallest courtyard to the grandest temple, these punishments unfolded like quiet stories stitched into the very skin of the city. They did not demand death, they demanded memory. And in the Aztec world, memory was sacred. It was said that the gods were not cruel, but precise. They did not lash for the sake of pain. They shaped men as sculptors shaped stone, not with force, but with intention, revealing beneath the chisel something more refined, something worthy of the heavens. The night sky above Tenochtitlan was moonless, a velvet tapestry pierced only by stars that blinked like ancient eyes. The waters of Lake Texcoco lay still, mirroring the constellations in perfect silence. It was a night for stories, a night when spirits walked lightly across the rooftops and dreams pressed close against the skin. In the deep hours, while most slept, the city prepared for a punishment that belonged to both shadow and fire. At the edge of the western precinct, in a district known for its weavers and storytellers, a man named Teoxiu had been accused of a crime more symbolic than visible, the deliberate corruption of a sacred song. Teoxiu was no common minstrel. He was a trained Huitlatoli singer, one entrusted with the ancient words spoken during rites of passage, marriage, birth, death. His voice had once floated through temple courtyards like mist, weaving between drums and prayers, binding families to their ancestors through sound. But recently, during a spring solstice ritual, he had sung a line that was not only unfamiliar, but profane. Instead of blessing the path of the sun with the words passed down from generations, he had inserted a verse that mocked the fertility rites. He said the gods were drunk on blood, that their hunger had no end, and that those who fed them were fools dancing to empty drums. Some had laughed nervously, others wept. A child vomited at his feet. The priest demanded clarity. He claimed it was art. There was no trial, only ritual. For what he had broken was not a law, but a line, a thread that connected the breath of now to the pulse of forever. Teoxiu was sentenced to endure the fireless song. He was brought at dusk to the House of Sound, a hollow circular chamber deep within the temple of Xochipilli, where music once thrummed like blood through the walls. There he was seated before an unlit brazier. Around him 12 singers of the old song stood, each bearing an unstrung instrument. For 13 nights they sang to him in silence. No chords, no chants, only lips moving, bodies swaying, feet tapping rhythms into stone with no sound to carry them. Teoxiu was commanded to sing along, though no one told him the melody. He tried, at first with defiance, then with confusion, then with dread. By the 6th night his voice cracked. By the 9th he whispered words that weren't his. By the 12th he had forgotten the shape of the verses. The songs had unwound from his memory like threads from a frayed loom. On the 13th night the singers spoke for the first time. "Now," they said, "you may speak your own song, but it must have no echo." He tried to sing, but the words fled from him. When he left the chamber, he walked with the stiffness of a man no longer sure where his voice ended and silence began. He returned to his home in the Weavers' district, but his music was never heard again. It is said that he took up dye work, staining fabrics with the colours of twilight, mixing hue with silence, crafting patterns only he understood. Meanwhile, in a neighbouring district where the bones of old warriors decorated the entryways and jaguar pelts hung like trophies over doorways, another judgment took shape, one as cruel as it was cold. A widow named Yeotl had violated the ritual of mourning. Her husband, a shield-bearer in the Emperor's Guard, had died during a campaign beyond the mountains. His body had never returned, only his feathered helmet and a small pouch of earth said to contain ashes from the battlefield. As was customary, Yeotl entered mourning, 40 days of fasting, head shorn, body covered in ashes. She sang the mourning songs, tended to his memorial fire, offered daily maize cakes to his spirit. But on the 21st day, she was seen laughing with a spice vendor in the market. Laughing, mouth open, shoulders shaking. Some said it was innocent, a memory shared, a joke offered gently in passing. But to laugh before mourning was complete, was to disrespect the spirit of the dead, to turn one's back on the ancestors before their journey had ended. The priesthood of Mictlantecutli, lord of the underworld, declared she had broken the path of smoke, the invisible bridge between the soul and its rest. Her punishment was called the laughter burial. At sunset, Yeotl was led to a dry riverbed east of the city, where urns of white clay stood half buried in the dust. She was dressed in black, her hands painted red, and her mouth sealed with beeswax and ash. She was made to lie down beside a stone effigy of her husband, crafted from memory, its face twisted into a pained smile. For 4 nights she lay there, unmoving, beneath the stars. Each morning the urns were filled with smoke from burning copal. Each evening a priest circled her with a rattle, reciting the names of spirits not yet home. She was not to speak, not to eat, not to dream. On the 5th day, the wax was removed from her mouth. She was told to whisper his name. She did. Only then was she allowed to rise, her red hands pressed against the earth as she crawled back into the living world. Her laughter, they said, had been buried. What voice she had left was soft, deliberate, never careless. Some pitied her, others feared her. The spice vendor never spoke to her again. And so the city watched quietly as another woman walked differently, as another man silenced himself, as punishment continued its silent work. Not in blood or blade, but in the small corners of the spirit, where pride and memory and voice meet. Because in Tenochtitlan, punishment was not only the price of offense. It was the ritual of becoming human again. Morning crept slowly across the causeways. gilding the stone with a pale amber hue, as if the sun were too cautious to rise fully. The lake, still and breathless, reflected the vast sky with unnerving perfection. It was in this hush, where even the gulls dared not cry, that a procession moved through the eastern quarter of Tenochtitlan. There were no drums, no chants, no banners, only footsteps and the creak of a wooden yoke across young shoulders. A girl, barely into womanhood, carried the weight. Her name was Axochitl, and she had been born into a family of modest gardeners, people who nurtured flowers for temple offerings and funerals. Her mother had said she came into the world during a lunar eclipse, her first cries drowned beneath the throb of drums. They believed it made her special, attuned to cycles, to rhythms deeper than rain. But Axochitl had broken a promise, one not to family or to the gods, but to a spirit. She had wandered one twilight into the grove where the cenote lay hidden, a water-filled sinkhole sacred to Chalchiotlicu, goddess of rivers and newborns. There she made a silent pact, as many young women did. She placed an offering, her grandmother's jade comb, and whispered a plea, for love, for the affection of a certain young fisherman who smiled without looking, who sang to the reeds as if he didn't know she was near. It was meant to be private, sacred. But Axochitl broke her vow within days. When the boy turned his eyes toward another, she returned to the cenote, not with grief but with anger. She threw a stone into the sacred pool and cursed the goddess aloud. The water did not stir, but the priests knew. When birds stopped roosting in the nearby trees, when the water turned cloudy, the keepers of the shrine traced the trail back to her. She confessed. Her punishment was not cruelty, it was consequence. Axochitl was bound by the burden of the broken vow. At dawn, a wooden yoke was placed across her shoulders, the kind normally used by beasts of burden. From either side hung 2 jars of water drawn from the cenote, one filled to the brim, the other cracked and leaking slowly. She was to carry them through the city for a full day without rest. Each drop lost from the broken jar was said to be a memory slipping away from the gods. She walked in silence, her feet blistering, the clay jars swaying with each step. People turned their eyes as she passed, not in scorn, but with wary reverence. Children pointed, women whispered. By dusk, her legs trembled with exhaustion, but still she walked. She was finally allowed to set the yoke down beside the edge of the lake, where a priest marked her forehead with water from the unbroken jar. She was not scolded, not shunned. But from that day on, she was never again seen near the grove. Instead, she took to planting lilies in silence, her fingers always wet with soil, her eyes following the sky with a quiet, longing humility. Not far from her district, within the quarters of the artisan caste, another punishment was unfolding, this time beneath a sky that had begun to grumble with distant thunder. The clouds gathered slowly, pregnant with the season's first true rains, and with them came the memory of another transgression, a deception carved not into stone, but into the trust of a community. The man was named Quaushikali. He was a renowned sculptor, known for his depictions of gods and heroes in basalt and jade. His hands had been kissed by rulers, his altars praised by priests, but in his pride, he had committed a quiet fraud. For 3 years, he had accepted commissions for sacred statuary meant for high temples, effigies that were to be blessed, offered, and unveiled before festivals. But Quaushikali, burdened by the sheer volume of requests and eager for silver, had begun repurposing old statues. He would chisel only their faces anew, polish the surface, and present them as divine work. To most, it passed unnoticed. But one day, a low priest from the far south recognized the curve of a forgotten idol in the new figure of Xipe Totec. The body was wrong. The gestures borrowed from a coastal god not worshipped in the valley. The truth unraveled quickly. His punishment was called the Echo in the Stone. He was not imprisoned. He was not beaten. Instead, he was made to carve a single idol every day for 20 days, each from raw, uncut basalt, each depicting only the face of the god Tezcatlipoca, the lord of the smoking mirror. No body, no arms, no posture, only the face. Each morning, he was given the stone and a quiet space near the temple wall. Each evening, his work was placed in a silent row, unblessed, unburned, untouched. They were not sacred. They were memory. By the end of the punishment, 20 faces stared back at him from the shadows. None smiled. It is said that he never touched stone again. Instead, he took up planting, first herbs, then maize. His hands remained strong, but he no longer looked people in the eye. When he died many years later, his home was found to contain one final carving, hidden beneath his bed, the face of Tezcatlipoca, weeping. In these stories, woven into the threads of life that formed Tenochtitlan's soul, the punishments were never empty displays. They were transformations. The gods did not delight in torment. They demanded reflection. And reflection, in a city of mirrors and blood, could shape even the sharpest stone into silence. Rain had finally come to Tenochtitlan, not in soft sheets or misting drizzles, but in a pounding torrent that turned the dust of the plazas into dark, sticky clay and filled the canals until their edges foamed. Thunder rolled across the lake like the deep voice of a waking god, and lightning cracked open the clouds in jagged streaks of silver and blue. Beneath the sheltering colonnades of the temple complexes, people gathered to watch and pray, grateful for the downpour but wary of what it stirred. For it was during the rains that old sins surfaced, sins long buried beneath stone and silence. And in the damp corridor of the Western Council House, a boy no older than 16 knelt in chains, trembling not from cold but from the echo of his own crime. His name was Tepiltzin, and he was a speaker of lies, not the lies of mischief or jest, but of poison. He had been raised in a scribe's household, where every word was weighed like cacao beans, every sentence crafted with care. His voice was beautiful, soft, articulate, with a timbre that soothed the ear, and he used it with cruelty. Topiltzin had crafted false accusations against a rival, a boy named Ixtlimatl, who had competed with him for a place in the temple school. He told the elders that Ixtlimatl had insulted the gods, drawn vulgar shapes in the dust near the altar, spoken against the rites of sacrifice. Witnesses were invented, details embroidered with alarming precision, and Ixtlimatl, stunned and speechless, was lashed and expelled from the school. It might have ended there, but 3 moons later, Ixtlamatl's mother came to the priests, her hands trembling, bearing a scrap of bark paper, a letter from her son, who had taken his own life near the edge of the Chinampa fields. He had carved the truth into the paper. The council summoned Tepiltzin. He confessed, weeping, begging that he had not known his words would lead to death. But the elders did not scold. They prepared the ritual at once. He would undergo the speaking wind. The punishment began with the cutting of the tongue, not in blood but in voice. Tepiltzin was forbidden to speak for 40 days. He was given a flute made of reed and told he must respond to every question, every request, every accusation, only through the instrument. If he failed to respond, he would go without food. If his notes were wrong, he would sleep outside. He was trained by a blind musician who lived in the temple of Xochipilli, the god of art and expression. Each night the musician sat beside him and whispered stories into the boy's ear, tales of gods who punished with silence, of echoes that could curse, of birds who wept instead of singing. And Tepiltzin began to understand. By the 20th day, he no longer cried. His songs became delicate, haunting, filled with minor notes that made the old weep in their sleep. Children would gather outside his chamber just to hear the rise and fall of his melodies. He no longer tried to explain. He only played. On the 40th day, his voice was restored. He did not speak. Instead, he placed the flute upon the altar of Tezcatlipoca and walked barefoot into the fields, where he became a keeper of birds. For the rest of his life, he was known not by name, but by the sound he once made in dusk, a 3-note whistle that trembled like wind over water. While Tepiltzin's story drifted into legend, another tale rooted itself in the southern quarter of the city, among the dancers, artisans, and healers. It was there that a widow named Malinal Xochitl performed a forbidden ritual. She was a healer of great skill, known for her salves and smoke cures, her ability to read dreams and calm infants who would not feed. She was respected, beloved even. But her sorrow ran deep. Her husband had died years before, lost to the sea during a storm, his bones never recovered. And though she had mourned, buried his clothes, offered maize at the water's edge, she still saw him in her dreams. One night, under the weight of her longing, she tried to summon him. This was not allowed. Only the high priests of Mictlan could summon spirits. Only during sanctioned rites, and never for love. To attempt such contact was to blur the veil between life and death, to risk opening paths that should remain closed. She was discovered not by neighbours, but by the gods. For the next 3 nights, blood appeared on her doorstep each morning, shaped into symbols no one could read. The wind moaned through her house, though every door was shut. Her own dreams turned cold, filled with the smell of river mud and weeping. The priests came. They entered her home without word, circled her hearth 3 times, and then led her silently to the steps of the House of Tears. Her punishment was the candle without flame. In the centre of the temple courtyard, they placed an unlit candle carved from bone, surrounded by white feathers and obsidian shards. Malin-al-Xochitl was told to sit before it for 9 nights, in silence, and not look away. Each night, a different person from the city came to speak beside her, not to her, but to the air around her. They told their stories of grief, lost lovers, dead children, fathers taken in war. Their tears fell onto the stones. None touched her, none looked her in the eye. On the 9th night, the priests asked if she would summon him again. She said nothing. The candle remained unlit. She was released. Afterward, she no longer healed. Her hands became slow, uncertain. But she began to write, strange symbols on bark paper, maps of dreams and grief. These writings were later buried beneath the temple for fear they might still call out. To the Aztecs, punishment was more than consequence. It was purification, transmutation. The soul, like maize, had to be stripped, soaked, ground, and reshaped. Only then could it nourish others. And so, under the watchful eyes of the stars, the rain fell still, and the city breathed, not in peace, but in order. The wind that swept across Tenochtitlan the following morning was sharp and cool, carrying with it the scent of wet stone and flowering cactus. The rain had passed, but its memory lingered in puddles that mirrored the sky, in the darkened walls of the temples, and in the softened hush of the city's heartbeat. On such a day, stories clung to the air like mist, tales of old missteps, sacred reckoning, and souls reshaped beneath the eyes of the gods. In the northeast quarter of the city, where the basket weavers lived in homes bound with reed and thatch, a woman named Tecoitzin was led into the open square by 2 elder priestesses. She wore no headdress. Her feet were bare. Her eyes, red from days without sleep, darted between the stones as if searching for a place to hide. But there was no hiding from what she had done. Tecoitzin had burned a name. Among the Mexica, names were more than labels. They were spirits, threads tied from the soul to the heavens. To speak someone's name was to invoke their presence. To remember them was to offer breath to their spirit. And to destroy that name, deliberately, with malice, was to sever them from the world. Tecoitzin had taken the bark paper scrolls of her dead sister, offerings kept in a clay urn by her sleeping mat, and cast them into fire during a night of fury. Witnesses said she had cursed the ashes, shouting that her sister had betrayed her in life and haunted her in dreams. No priest had given permission. No ritual had sanctioned the flame. No song had called the fire to consume with grace. The act was raw, personal, full of hate. The punishment was not immediate. The priestesses waited for her dreams to speak, and they did. For 3 nights, Tecoitzin awoke screaming, her voice hoarse, claiming that her sister's name was echoing from the corners of her home, that her own name had begun to change, slipping from her mouth like a stranger's whisper. She begged for cleansing. The priestesses offered instead the weaving of silence. At the centre of the plaza, a great loom was erected, taller than a man, strung with fine white thread. Tecoitzin was placed before it, dressed in grey cotton, her hands marked with blue dye. She was told to weave a new name for her sister. But she could not use glyphs, symbols, or spoken words. She had to weave emotion, grief, memory, longing into the fabric, using only colour, pattern, and rhythm. For 13 days she sat before the loom. Each morning the women of the community brought her dyed threads, crimson for blood, yellow for betrayal, green for the absence of children, and violet for unspoken forgiveness. Her hands worked slowly at first, clumsy with regret. But soon her fingers found a rhythm, one born not of tradition but of grief reshaped into offering. The tapestry that emerged was not large, but it pulsed with depth, swirls that bled into one another, knots that interrupted symmetry, faint streaks of gold that appeared only in certain light. When it was finished, she offered it to the priestesses. They did not bless it. They did not praise it. They took it to the lake at dawn and let it drift, carried gently into the mist. The wind did not fight it. the water did not sink it. Tekoitzin returned to her home and never spoke her sister's name again, not in anger, not in reverence, but her hands wove endlessly from that day forward, not for trade, not for temple, only for memory. While her story softened in the quiet quarters, another unfolded in the high courts of justice, where nobles stood trial not for theft or violence, but for sins of arrogance cloaked in legality. A lord named Necuametl, known for his eloquence and sharp mind, had used his influence to circumvent a dowry agreement, denying a merchant family the proper union of their daughter with one of his sons. It was not illegal, but it was dishonorable. He had offered false witnesses, altered the marriage contracts, and turned a sacred bond into a transaction. The daughter, shamed and disgraced, had been sent away to a distant province, her fate unknown. The council did not bring him in chains. They summoned him with silence. In the Hall of Seven Voices, where matters of the nobility were judged, he was made to sit beneath the painted ceiling of Tanaka Tekutli, the creator god of duality and harmony. No one accused him. No one shouted. Instead, the council presented the broken contract on a reed mat and waited. He denied nothing. His punishment was the dust of unjoined hands. He was ordered to walk every path between the 4 great districts of Tenochtitlan, holding in his palm a single marriage ring, carved from turquoise and obsidian, untouched, unsanctified. At each crossroad, a married couple would approach, say nothing, and touch the ring with their fingertips. The journey lasted 12 days. With each touch, the ring grew warmer, heavier. By the final day, Necuametl wept openly, clutching it to his chest like a wound. He returned it to the temple of Xochiquetzal, the goddess of love, and knelt until the moon rose. His family's name was not disgraced. But from that day, no marriage in his house was permitted without public blessing and a gift offered to the family of the bride, a law he himself had etched in stone at the temple gate. Thus, one injustice became a vow for generations to come. The rain had ended, but its echo remained in puddles and footpaths, in the glisten of moss-covered stone. And in the quiet of dusk, when the fires began to burn low and the children's laughter faded, the people of Tenochtitlan turned to the stories that bound them. Stories not just of punishment, but of reckoning, and of souls remade beneath the silent watching stars. In the heart of the city, where the streets curved around temples like tributaries around a great mountain, a man stood beneath the shadow of the snake wall, his arms bare, his eyes steady, and his lips closed in solemn defiance. His name was Yaotel, once a warrior of the House of the Eagle, now accused of the gravest sin that could be named without fire, speaking prophecy without sanction. The gods gave visions, yes. They whispered in dreams, burned their messages into the clouds and rivers, turned bones into omens and blood into maps. But only the priests, those trained within the Karmakak, were permitted to interpret such messages for the people. Prophecy was not a gift for private mouths. Yet Yaotel had spoken. He had climbed the temple steps at dawn, not with blade or offering, but with words. Before the priests could stop him, he had cried out to the people in the square, proclaiming that a great bird with feathers of silver and fire would one day descend from the east, bringing with it new gods, pale faces, and a hunger not for blood, but for gold. He spoke of temples drowned in smoke, of rivers running backward, of the gods falling silent. Some laughed, others gasped. But the priests did not hesitate. They seized him. Yaotel did not resist. He only repeated his warning once and then fell quiet. He was bound and taken not to the temple, but to the chamber of quills, where false prophets and madmen were judged not with lashes, but with ritual silence. His punishment was called the speaking mask. For 9 days, Yaotel was made to wear a mask crafted from 2 materials, obsidian and clay. The left half was smooth black, reflecting every flicker of torchlight. The right was dull, cracked and painted with lines of white and red to resemble fire. The mask had no mouth. He was placed in the plaza at midday, tied to a post not with rope but with silence itself. No one was permitted to speak to him, feed him or touch him. Instead, the priests chanted. For hours each day, they sang the true prophecies, the accepted visions, the songs of future kings, the warnings carved into temple walls. These were not to comfort him. They were to drown him. On the 10th morning, the mask was removed. Yaotel's face was pale, his lips bloodied from pressing against the clay, but he still did not weep. He only looked to the east. When asked if he would speak again, he said only, "The wind remembers." The priests debated whether to banish or kill him. But an elder, one who had once seen fire fall from a clear sky, intervened. Yaotel was allowed to live, but only if he swore to speak no more before crowds. He agreed. He disappeared shortly thereafter. Some said to the mountains, others to the coast. But children remembered his story and whispered it beneath blankets when the wind howled just so. Elsewhere, in the southern gardens of the city, where songbirds were bred and painted butterflies tethered with silk threads for the delight of nobles, another quiet reckoning took place. This one, small, personal, and no less painful. A boy named Xocotzin had stolen a feather. Not from a market stall or a hunter's satchel, but from the aviary of the temple itself. It was a Quetzal feather, long and brilliant, taken not for need but for want. He had seen it shimmer in the light, watched it tremble with each movement of the bird's wings, and felt something in him reach for beauty without thought. He hid it beneath his tunic, carried it home, and placed it beneath his sleeping mat. But beauty stolen becomes a thorn. The feather faded in colour within days, its lustre dulling as though it mourned its theft. The boy grew restless, his dreams filled with beating wings and the low cries of birds in mourning. And one morning he awoke to find his fingers dyed green, the same hue as the feather. His mother saw. She said nothing. She brought him to the temple herself. The punishment for theft from the divine was not always pain. Sometimes it was correction through longing. Xocotzin was given the feather without flight. He was not lashed. He was not cursed. He was given a task. For one full season, he would care for the aviary from which he had stolen, clean the cages, feed the birds, whisper the songs of the caretakers into their trembling feathers. But he was forbidden to touch another Quetzal. They were right there, so close, so dazzling, yet always beyond his reach. Every time one flapped its wings, he looked away. Every time its feathers caught the light, his heart clenched. By the end of the season, he had not stolen again. He had learned not to possess beauty, but to guard it. And when he was released from his duty, the high priest gifted him a single feather, not of the Quetzal, but of the hummingbird, worn short yet vivid with motion. He wore it on a simple string around his neck for the rest of his life. In a city where punishment took on the shape of story and story the shape of memory, even the smallest crimes left echoes. They were not buried in darkness, but held to the light, not to shame, but to transform. Because every feather lost to greed, every mask worn in warning, every silence endured, became part of the music of the city. And the gods, ever listening, heard not just the songs of praise, but also the slow, careful melody of repentance. The heat returned to the city with the weight of memory, thick, slow, and restless. It pressed against the stones of the plazas, made the smoke from cook fires hang lower in the alleys, and caused the lake's surface to shimmer as if it were dreaming. In this heavy air, even breath felt sacred. And in the sacred quiet of the temple gardens, another judgment was unfolding. Not for theft, not for blasphemy, but for vanity dressed in devotion. Her name was Atlao, and she had danced too well. Atlao was a temple dancer, chosen from childhood for the grace of her movements and the stillness of her gaze. Her hands told stories. Her feet knew the rhythm of old gods. She performed during festivals to Xochiquetzal and Coyolxauhqui, her body a vessel for myths older than the stones beneath her. But over time, something shifted. Her movements became sharper, less humble. She began to turn her head toward the crowd rather than the altar. She wore her anklets too tight so the bells would sing louder. She lengthened the steps not for the gods, but for the eyes watching, and the priests noticed. It was during the Feast of Flowers that the misstep bloomed fully. Atlao had been chosen to lead the dance of blooming hearts, a ceremonial movement meant to mirror the unfolding petals of divine forgiveness. But as she reached the center of the temple's great flower mosaic, she turned her back on the altar to receive the crowd's applause. The gesture was small, but in the language of ritual, it screamed. The punishment came not in fury, but with the slow, cold hand of ritual correction. She was sentenced to the petal that faces away. For one moon cycle, she was to dance each morning in the courtyard of the quiet temple, where no crowds gathered, where no drums beat. Instead of elaborate garb, she wore plain cotton. Instead of anklets, her feet were bare. And instead of leading, she followed, the slow steps of elder dancers whose movements bore no pride, only memory. Each step she took was mirrored by a girl younger than her, eyes wide with innocence. Each mistake she had once made was reflected back in the purity of the one behind. On the 13th day, she was asked to lead again. She declined. Instead, she knelt before the flower mosaic, pressed her forehead to the stone, and placed her anklets upon the ground, not to abandon them, but to offer them anew. From then on, Atlau continued to dance. But never again did her eyes seek the crowd. Elsewhere, in the shade of the old merchant district, where obsidian tools clinked in rhythm with daily trade, another tale of punishment unfolded, not through ceremony, but through salt. The man was Tlemili, a salt vendor. He had for years sold brine and flavoured crystals to the courts and temple kitchens. His salt was considered superior, whiter, sharper, purer. But it was a lie. Tlemili had begun mixing his salt with powdered chalk, stretching his product, profiting from deceit. At first the change was unnoticed, but over time the difference was tasted in the food of the high priests. Sacrificial meat cured with his salt spoiled early. Ritual drinks turned bitter, suspicion bloomed. The inspectors tested his wares. The truth was found. His punishment was the mouth of the earth. At the edge of the salt flats, beyond the eastern canal, there was a sinkhole sacred to Tlaltekutli, the earth goddess. There Tlemili was made to dig salt from the ground with his hands. No tools, no baskets, no rest. For 7 days he laboured skin-cracking, eyes stung by wind and white reflection. The salt bit into his cuts. The sun marked his back. Each evening the salt he gathered was not kept. It was poured back into the earth. Only on the 8th morning was he permitted to bring a single handful to the temple kitchen. There the cooks tasted it in silence. They said nothing. From that day Tlemili was allowed to return to trade, but he never again claimed purity. Instead, his stall bore a sign carved with one word, returned. People continued to buy from him, perhaps out of pity, perhaps out of trust, reborn through humility. And far to the north, in a courtyard where the wind was trapped by high walls and time felt slower, a punishment of a different kind took form. One not of greed or arrogance, but of forgetting. A young priest named Xolotl had failed to complete a ritual. It had been a small rite, a daily invocation to Tonatiuh, the sun god, meant to be recited before sunrise with the lighting of 5 incense sticks. Xolotl had been distracted. A dream had lingered. His hands moved too slowly. The incense was lit after the first light touched the mountain's edge. The sun had risen before being summoned. No catastrophe followed. The sky did not crack. The people still breathed. But the priests saw it for what it was, a fracture in the discipline of the divine. His punishment was called the Shadow of Dawn. Each day for 10 days, Xolotl was made to rise before the stars faded. He was led to the temple roof, where he stood alone, facing the east. But he was not to light incense. He was not to pray. He was only to wait, watching the horizon until the first sliver of light appeared, knowing that it would rise without him. Only on the final day was he given the flint and copal. He lit the fire with trembling hands and wept as the smoke rose. It was not the delay that had punished him. It was the silence. The realization that the gods did not need his hands, but demanded them anyway. So the city moved forward, stone by stone, breath by breath. Its people shaped not by the lash, but by the mirror, for every fault a reckoning, for every reckoning a remaking. And in the spaces between rain and sun, prayer and silence, punishment wove its slow, deliberate path. The days turned dry once more, and the dust from the southern roads began to gather on the rims of clay jugs and the folds of woven cloaks. The lake, though still vast and glistening, lost its edge of coolness. Its reeds browned, and the frogs fell silent. The people of Tenochtitlan knew this rhythm well. The gods were hungrier during drought, and the punishments that came in this season were sharper, more deliberate, like thorns underfoot. In the artisan quarter near the House of Copper, a boy named Huitziton had been brought before the elders accused of wasting fire. It was not a dramatic crime. There had been no explosion, no burnt offering, no sacred hearth undone. But fire in the Aztec world was no mere tool. It was divine essence, gift of Huehueteotl, the old fire god, and of Xiuhtecuhtli, the youthful flame that warmed the world. Every spark was a prayer, every blaze a heartbeat of the world. Huitziton, in his boredom, had used sacred fire to roast insects. Not for food, not for need, but for amusement. He had taken the coals left after a ritual and hidden them near his family's drying shed, where he fed the embers small creatures, ants, beetles, dragonflies, watching them curl and blacken in the heat. A child's game, perhaps, but in the wrong place, with the wrong flame. It was his sister who saw, who told their mother, who whispered to the elders. There was no rage, only quiet ritual. His punishment was the path of coals. On the first morning, he was taken to the temple of Huehueteotl, where the fire was oldest and never extinguished. There the priests marked his soles with ash and tied small bells to his ankles, not for song, but for reminder. Then they laid out a trail of cooled coals, stretching from the base of the temple to the plaza's edge. For 10 mornings, Huitzitone walked this path barefoot. Not hot enough to blister, but not soft either. The coals shifted under him, crunched, whispered. With each step, the bells jingled softly and the city remembered. At the end of each walk, he was made to kneel before a stone brazier and offer the names of the insects he had burned. At first, he could not remember. Then he began to invent names, small and strange, Tlanitl, Kozamak, Zali, Tepecoyo, as if naming them made them real again. On the final day, the priests gave him a single spark on a thin splinter of wood. He was told to carry it back to his family's hearth. He did so with both hands. He would never waste fire again. Not far from this, in the merchant quarter near the Red Temples, another punishment took shape, one woven with shadows and song, punishment for a crime of listening when one should not. A girl named Chimalma had been caught eavesdropping on sacred council. She was a servant in the house of a high priest and had crept too near the chamber door during a midnight meeting between nobles. No words had been repeated, no secrets leaked. But she had crossed a boundary no servant was ever meant to approach. To hear what was not meant for her ears was to risk misaligning the sacred order. Her punishment was the Wall of Whispers. She was brought to a long, curved wall outside the House of Wind, a wall carved with the symbols of speech, breath, and silence. There, for one cycle of the moon, she was required to sit each night and whisper aloud everything she had ever heard in her life that was not meant for her. Old gossip, overheard prayers, conversations between parents, between lovers, between priest and God, all whispered to the wall. The wall answered nothing. But the night winds carried her voice, dispersing her secrets like petals into the lake. On the final night, she was given a painted fan, decorated with the symbol of Ehecatl, the wind god, and told to speak no more for 3 days. If she needed something, she must draw it in the air. When her voice returned, it was softer, and her ears sharper not for intrusion but for kindness. She became a singer of the old songs, those whose words carried power only when offered with permission. And high above them all, upon the great Templo Mayor, where the twin shrines of Tlaloc and Huitzilopochtli crowned the heavens, another figure was being prepared for a different kind of punishment, one not of the body, but of faith itself. A priest named Tenochcayotl had delayed an offering. It was a small delay. The rain ceremony had been pushed back by half a day to allow the arrival of certain noble guests from the coastal provinces. He believed it would bring honor, attention, and unity. But the gods do not wait. That day, the clouds had scattered, the wind turned dry, the lake dropped an inch, and no birds flew overhead. The priests argued, the omens burned, and Tenochcayotl was stripped of his blue robe. His punishment was the waiting sky. Each morning for 13 days he climbed the temple steps alone. No drums, no witnesses. He stood at the altar of Tlaloc and waited. He could not offer food, blood, or smoke. Only his presence. He waited from dawn until the sun stood at its peak. No words, no songs, only silence and heat. On the 14th morning the rain returned. A single drop fell upon the altar stone. He wept, and from that day forward he served no longer as a celebrant of rites, but as a teacher of time. In the city of gods, every misstep was a thread pulled from the weave, and punishment, slow and sacred, was the act of mending, stitch by stitch, with fire, with whispers, with waiting. The wind shifted in the early hours of the morning, drifting in low from the lake with a strange scent, sweet, almost floral, but layered with something older, wood smoke, dried blood, and rain on ancient stone. The scent curled through the narrow alleys of Tenochtitlan like a question, brushing against reed fences and cotton curtains. waking dogs that did not bark and birds that did not sing. Somewhere in the northwest corner of the city, a door creaked open, and with it began the slow unfolding of another judgment. Her name was Papalotzin, and her crime was kindness given at the wrong time. She was a flower seller. Her hands were always stained with pollen, and her sleeves always smelled of marigold. She made wreaths for children's birthdays and garlands for funerals. Her laughter was quiet but ever present. The people in her district loved her, not for beauty or wealth, but for the gentleness she wove into every word. But kindness in the wrong season could invite the wrath of gods. A prisoner had been led past her stall, a man condemned to death, his face painted blue, his heart promised to Huitzilopochtli before the sun reached its highest mark. He walked in chains, shoulders bowed, his steps the last he would ever take. And Papalotzin, seeing him pass, had reached into her basket and offered him a flower, a single shockhetal bloom, golden and open. The man took it. He smiled, and in that moment, a ritual was broken. No prisoner bound for sacrifice could accept offerings from the living. To do so was to blur the line between those going to the gods and those staying behind. The priests believed it confused the journey, weakened the offering, and disrespected the sacrifice. She was not dragged away. No guards struck her. Instead, she was summoned at sunset when the air grew cool and the streets emptied. She followed the call in silence, her hands still damp from washing petals. At the House of the Feathered Serpent, she was given her sentence. It was called The Flower Returned. At dawn, Papalotzin was brought to the foot of the Templo Mayor. She was not clothed in rags nor shamed with paint. Instead, she wore a white robe, simple but clean, and in her arms she carried a basket of blooms, all the same kind as the one she had given. She was instructed to walk through the city, retracing the same path the condemned man had taken. And with each step she offered a flower to the earth, not to people, not to altars, to the ground itself. Every few paces she would kneel, press a flower into the soil, and whisper a single word, "Kui." Do you see? Some watched her from behind door frames. Children followed for a time, mimicking her whispers before being hushed by their mothers. By dusk her basket was empty. She returned to her stall where no flowers remained. For one moon cycle she did not sell. She did not weave wreaths. She did not speak of her crime. But the next offering day she returned to the plaza, laid out her mats and arranged her blossoms with the same gentle care. Only now she never gave a flower to someone who did not ask. And in the centre of her stall stood a single empty vase, always waiting, always untouched. Elsewhere, in the weaving quarter near the canal's bend, a young boy named Tlanextic had been brought forward for punishment, not for violence, nor theft, nor falsehood, but for a mistake that bloomed from ignorance. He had mocked a birthmark. His sister, newly turned 10, had a dark patch over her left eye. The family said it was a blessing from Tezcatlipoca, a mark that meant she had been touched in the womb by a dreaming jaguar. But Tlanextic, in his youth and pride, had laughed at her. Not once, but many times, especially when others could hear. He had mimicked her face in the courtyard, called her names in song. She cried. She stopped speaking, and still he sang. The family did not scold him. They went to the temple instead. The priests spoke with calm voices, slow gestures. Tlanextic's punishment was the eye that sees. At dawn, he was blindfolded with a cloth dyed in 3 colours, black for mystery, blue for truth, and red for shame. He was led to the House of Faces, where masks of every kind lined the walls. Faces twisted in pain, in laughter, in grief, in longing. Each day for 5 days he sat before a different mask. He was not told what it showed. He could not see. He was only asked to describe what he imagined from the silence of the room, the feel of air, the weight of presence. He spoke of joy, then confusion. Then, by the 3rd day, he whispered, "She's crying." On the 5th day, the cloth was removed. He was led to a mirror, not one of polished obsidian, but water, still and dark. And there he saw his own reflection, not distorted, not broken, just his face unchanged. But for the first time he touched it gently, as if it might belong to him. That evening he went to his sister and painted his own eye with soot. He wore the mark for 7 days without being asked, and when it faded, he painted it again, not out of punishment but reverence. In Tenochtitlan, cruelty was never ignored, but neither was it met with equal force. The gods demanded balance. And so the city, wide and sacred and breathing with stone and water, continued its patient, relentless weaving of justice, not through rage but through ritual, not to destroy but to teach, not to silence but to reshape. The moon hung heavy and full over Tenochtitlan that night, casting pale light across rooftops, tiled with obsidian and walkways worn smooth by barefoot prayers. The stars blinked slowly, like watchers unmoved by time, and in the distant quarters where stone met swamp, another punishment stirred, quietly, deliberately, with a weight that could not be undone. This was not the punishment of a thief, nor a liar, nor a blasphemer. It was the reckoning of a noble who had turned away from duty, not in defiance, but in cowardice. His name was Istiowatzin, a son of minor lords, born into wealth and prestige, educated among the Kalmakak priests, trained to speak the old words and carry the ceremonial blade. He had not failed in war. He had not betrayed his people. His sin, simple yet unforgivable, was this: he had refused to take part in the fire ceremony. Once every 52 years, when the calendar wheel turned and the end of an age approached, the Aztecs gathered to renew the world. Fires across the city were extinguished, hearts were stilled, and on the Hill of the Star, a man was chosen to receive the fire of rebirth. Cut open as the heavens aligned, his chest ignited so flame might return to the people. It was the highest honor, a sacred end, and Istiowatzin had been chosen. But on the eve of the ceremony, he vanished. He was found before sunrise, curled beside the lake, his fine robes soaked, his voice hoarse from sobbing. He had not fled the city, but had hidden among reeds like a child escaping his chores. The priests did not strike him. They said nothing. They simply turned away, and the ceremony went on with another, a quieter man, whose heart burned before dawn and brought fire back to the world. But Istiowatzin was not forgotten. His punishment was named the Fireless Lord. He was stripped not of his life, but of every symbol that marked him noble. His hair was cut in the pattern of a slave. His ear ornaments were melted before his eyes. His family's crest was scratched from the stone at the entry to their home. But the most enduring part of his punishment was this: he was forbidden to light fire, not to cook, not to warm, not to offer. For 13 years, one for each sky of the upper world, he could not touch flame. He ate food prepared cold, walked in darkness after sunset, and could not join the festivals of light. When fire rituals were performed, he was made to stand with his back turned, eyes lowered, hands folded. The people called him Tekulit Lampa, the noble of the dark. He never married, never sired children, yet he lived. And at the end of the 13th year, he was brought once more to the base of the temple. There, a single ember was placed in his palm. He did not cry, he did not speak. He simply held it until it burned through the skin and dropped to the earth. Then he pressed his palm to the stone and walked away. Far from the courts of fire and the nobility, in the quieter district of the Chinampa farmers, another kind of punishment grew, not from fear or shame, but from the cold simplicity of negligence. A woman named Tlilpalotl had forgotten the name of her ancestor. It was not a deliberate forgetting. She had not spat upon the altars or torn the woven figures from the household shrine. But when the time came for the annual offering, the day when each family fed the spirit of their oldest known kin, she stood before the table with empty hands. She could not remember the name, not the face, not the deeds, only that there had been a grandfather who fished from the lake and whistled while he worked. The priests were called, not to punish but to restore. Still, she was sentenced, as was right. Her punishment was called the voice of the clay. She was taken to a quiet hut by the water's edge. There she was given a lump of river clay and a simple task. She must shape it each day into the face she thought she had forgotten. No image was provided, no guidance given. Each morning she would sit, pressing thumb and knuckle into soft earth, pulling cheekbones from memory, carving wrinkles with trembling nails. Each night she left the figure outside her door, and the lake mist softened its edges. Sometimes the nose was too wide, sometimes the brow too high. But slowly, over the days, the face began to settle into something consistent. On the 13th day, a child from the neighborhood passed her home, stopped and whispered, "He looks like my uncle." The next morning, she was visited by her aunt, who brought a string of shells once worn by the grandfather. She laid them beside the clay, and Tlilpalotl wept. The name returned that night in a dream. Yohualan, the one who moves through fog. She offered food the next day. The altar accepted it, and in that acceptance she was restored. So too was her place in the chain. And in the narrow streets that led back to the market, another punishment unfolded under the silent watching gaze of a carved serpent. A child had cursed during a festival, not in anger, not at another, but toward the gods when the wind blew over the fire and scattered her paper offerings. She had shouted a word not meant for young mouths. The crowd fell quiet. The fire hissed. She was brought before the elders, not to be struck or scolded, but to be shaped. Her punishment was the word that walks. She was made to write the word she had said on a slip of bark, carry it through the city, and explain its meaning to anyone who asked. No hiding, no lying. At first, the people laughed. Then they questioned, and she began to feel the weight of meaning. By sunset, she buried the word in the dirt beside her mother's hearth, not with shame, but with care. And the gods, who cared not for perfection, but for reverence, let the winds settle once more. In the eastern quarter of Tenochtitlan, where the morning sun fell earliest upon the stepped roofs and warmed the clay tiles before any other part of the city, there stood a narrow corridor between two homes, a place known not by name but by sound. The wind whistled there in a strange way, as if weaving through invisible reeds, and neighbours called it the Passage of Secrets. It was there, beneath hanging gourds and drying peppers, that the next punishment began, with a whisper that never should have been spoken. A woman named Coyolakwe, respected for her healing hands and the bitter teas she brewed to cleanse the belly and calm the heart, had spoken ill of the rain. It was not a curse, not a formal denial, only a phrase spoken in frustration when her herbs soured during an unexpected storm. The rain comes only to spoil, she had said, not knowing that a priest passed nearby, his ears still attentive from the morning's rites. To speak against the rain was to speak against Tlaloc, the giver of life, the bearer of lightning and corn. And while the gods forgave many trespasses of body and heart, words were different. Words once spoken moved like smoke, impossible to catch, remembered by the sky itself. The priest did not confront her. He simply told the temple, and Coyolakwe, though surprised, did not deny the words. Her punishment was the garden without shadow. She was brought before the shrine of Tlaloc's tears, where waters poured endlessly from stone mouths into a wide basin that never overflowed. There she was instructed to plant a new garden, one meant not for healing, but for asking. The plot was small, square, and surrounded on all sides by white stone, leaving it open to the sun at all hours. No shade, no rest. Every seed she sowed was marked with a shell. Every stalk that sprouted had to be counted aloud at dawn in prayer. But the strange thing was this: nothing grew. For 7 days the soil remained bare. The 8th day brought a single sprout, thin, trembling. By the 15th the garden bloomed wildly with herbs not of her choosing. Blue blossoms, sharp red roots, curling vines with leaves shaped like tears. She tended it without complaint, her brow darkening from the constant sun. When the moon returned to fullness, the priest came again and asked her to speak. Not of her guilt, but of the storm. She did. She thanked the rain for its cruelty, its swiftness, its blindness. Even when it spoils, she said, it reminds me I am not in control. The priest nodded, and the garden was left to grow as it would. Coyolakwe returned to her home, but she never again spoke of weather without first touching the earth. And not far from that same quarter, in a household of warriors whose ancestors' names were carved into the temple's base, a boy named Mixkawa faced judgment, not for his actions but for his silence. He had witnessed a crime. A youth from the House of Stones had been struck during practice, not by accident but in anger, with a sharpened obsidian blade meant only for show. The wound was deep, and though the boy recovered, the scar remained. Mixkawa had seen it. He had known the blow was deliberate, but he had said nothing, out of fear, out of confusion. Out of the strange loyalty that binds boys together even when they know it should not. His silence cost nothing immediately, but the lie it bred festered. When the truth emerged, it came not from him, but from the boy who had struck, racked with guilt and seeking redemption. The elders summoned Mixkawa. He expected to be beaten, banished, shamed before his peers. But the priests, after hearing his trembling voice, offered another path. His punishment was the thread that broke. He was handed a long cord, thick, dyed in the colours of the warrior's school, and for 10 nights he was to knot it. Not in any pattern, not in any design. Each knot would represent a truth he had failed to say, a moment he had remained still when he should have moved. Each night he tied the thread slowly, deliberately, his hands blistered by the friction, his eyes wet with the memory of what he had feared to name. On the final night, he presented the cord. It was not beautiful, it was not symmetrical, but it was full. The priests took it and burned it at dawn, the smoke rising into a sky that bore no judgment, only light. From that day, Mixkawa became a speaker, not a priest, not a singer, but one who told what he saw. He was sent to neighbouring villages to gather stories, to listen and carry words home. And in his voice there was never again hesitation. In the centre of the city, where the steps of the Templo Mayor led not only upward but inward into the minds of the people, a final punishment for that season was recorded. A sculptor had carved a god's image with eyes closed, not in mockery, not in ignorance, but in a moment of personal grief. His daughter had died, and he could not bear to give the god a gaze she would never return, but gods must see. So his punishment was the gaze returned. He was ordered to remake the image, this time with eyes open but with no tools, only his hands. Clay was brought, rough and unyielding. The sculptor pressed, moulded, shaped, his fingers bled, his joints cracked. But when the image stood, the god's eyes were open, and his own could finally weep. In Tenochtitlan, punishment was not cruelty. It was memory, shaped into form. It was the sound of the gods breathing through hands, through silence, through words long buried beneath the soil. And in that city, bound by water and fire, every wound became a lesson, and every lesson a song waiting to be sung. The city's breath had slowed with the turning of the season. The air, once restless with drums and voices, had grown still, as if even Tenochtitlan needed moments of silence to remember itself. The lake lay glass-like at dawn, the great temple sat heavy beneath the soft pink sky, and in the hush that followed a season of offerings, there came a punishment not loud or visible, but buried deep in the fibres of one man's legacy. He was called Matlalquayetzin, a keeper of codices. His task was sacred, to preserve memory, not just names and dates, but visions, stories of the gods, records of the stars, maps of harvest and war. With deer hide and bark paper, with pigments drawn from insects and stone, he painted the world into permanence. But in one record, just one, he had changed a line. It was not a matter of vanity or pride. It was love. The codex in question was meant to be a formal record of land inheritance, marking the boundary of plots after the death of a warrior lord who had no surviving sons. The land should have gone to the nearest blood cousin. But the woman who tended the lord in his final years, Yolotzin, was a weaver with no noble blood. She had no claim, only memory and a heart full of devotion. Matlalquayetzin knew her. He had seen her wait in the rain outside the temple, offerings in hand, eyes cast low. And when the time came to paint the codex, he added one glyph, a small curl of red beside her name, signifying an honoured place. It was enough. The land was granted to her. No one questioned it for years, until another scribe, tracing genealogy for a different matter, noticed the mark. It was brought before the council. The scribe did not deny it. He bowed low, admitted the addition, and named love as his reason. They did not punish him with ink or silence. They gave him the Codex of Emptiness. Each morning, for 20 days, Matlalquayetzin was brought fresh sheets of bark paper, a full set of pigments and perfect brushes. He was told to paint, but nothing, no record, no memory, no story, only colour, only shape, only rhythm. No glyphs were allowed, no meaning. It was a task designed not to erase him, but to make him confront the loss of trust. At first he painted flowers, then faces, then storms that swallowed mountains. But over the days the shapes grew stranger, loops within loops, circles that bled into one another, rivers that ended in empty space. On the final day he painted nothing. He sat with the brush in hand and stared at the paper until sunset. Then, without a word, he stood and left. The paintings were not destroyed. They were stored in a vault below the temple of Xochipilli, considered visions too abstract for ordinary eyes, yet too heartfelt to dismiss. He was never again asked to paint records, but he taught the young scribes with a fervour that bordered on prayer, and he was known to say, "Ink remembers more than we allow it." Not far from his quiet exile, in the quarter where fishmongers chanted songs to the moon as they hauled in their catch, a woman named Itzmalin faced her own punishment, one woven through with scent and memory. She had tampered with a funerary bundle. It was her cousin, a boy of 9, drowned in a sudden canal flood. He had been gentle, fond of frogs and cloud watching. When his body was brought home and wrapped in cotton, his belongings were placed inside: a small carved turtle, a flute, and a pouch of maize. But Itzmalin, in secret, had removed the flute. She had always loved the sound, said it reminded her of wind through papaya leaves, and when she touched it, she felt him there as if he would return. The act was not theft, not greed. It was longing, but longing had no place in death rites. The spirit needed every part of his life to pass freely into the underworld. Without his flute, the path would be uneven. She confessed days later, trembling, the flute wrapped in woven cloth. Her punishment was the listening sleep. Each night for a full cycle of the moon, she was made to sleep within the House of Echoes, a chamber carved into the side of the temple hill, where wind moved in strange ways and sounds from the city were funneled and bent. She slept on reeds. Beside her lay the flute, untouched. Each night she was told to listen. To what, they did not say. At first she heard the cries of merchants, the chatter of night birds, the distant footfalls of temple guards, then whispers, then water. And on the 23rd night a single clear note, one played by lips no longer living. She returned the flute the next day to the boy's bundle, now housed in the ancestor crypts. The wind that passed over the city that evening carried the smell of burning copal and lilies. And in the hush of that twilight, a final tale unfolded in a courtyard where a young noble had laughed during a morning song. He had not meant disrespect. He had found the rhythm odd, the pitch strained, but laughter, once released, cannot be caught. His punishment was the song with no sound. He was taught to play the teponastli drum for 12 days, only he was given no sticks. He tapped with open palms, day and night, matching rhythms he could not hear, only feel. On the final day his hands bled, and when asked what he had learned, he said that not all music is for joy. Tenochtitlan listened, as it always did, and beneath its calm stone face the city stored each lesson, each breath, each misstep turned into ritual. It did not forget, it did not rage, it shaped. The light of early dawn crept across the water like a whisper, soft and grey, barely brushing the tops of the floating chinampas before it reached the stone bones of Tenochtitlan. The city, though vast and vibrant in the noonday sun, in these earliest hours seemed wrapped in a kind of hush, a reverence not imposed by temple law, but grown from within its very rhythm. It was in this breath between darkness and fire that another soul was led to judgment, and another punishment was set to begin. His name was Tlahuicol, and he was a man of the shield, strong, quiet, unwavering in battle. He had earned the right to wear the eagle feathers across his shoulders, to march at the head of the procession during the feasts of Huitzilopochtli. His loyalty had never been questioned, his skill never doubted. It was not war that undid him, nor weakness, nor betrayal. It was mercy. Tlahuicol had spared a life on the battlefield. The campaign had been swift, a punitive raid against a rebellious outpost near the mountain's edge. His spear had found its mark, and his opponent fell, wounded, bleeding but alive. The man had dropped his weapon, whispered the name of his child, and closed his eyes. Tlahuicol stepped back. Others saw. They dragged the wounded man away, and Tlahuicol did not speak. But word spread, as it always did. Mercy was not forbidden among the Mexica, but it was regulated. A captured warrior must be taken with ritual. Their life must be claimed in accordance with the gods' hunger. To spare without offering, to hesitate without prayer, was to disrupt the order that war was meant to serve. The priesthood summoned him. He came without defense, his eyes downcast, not ashamed, only resigned. They gave him a sentence rarely spoken aloud. The blade turned inward. For 13 days he was forbidden to hold a weapon, not just in battle, at all. His spear was taken, his dagger sealed, even the obsidian blades of his meal knives replaced with dull bone. He was not allowed to spar, not allowed to train. He was to walk among the boys of the House of Youths, not as a master, but as an observer, watching as others repeated the drills he had perfected. And each evening he knelt in the courtyard of the god of war, facing a rack of weapons he could no longer touch. At the end of the 13th day, he was handed a single spear shaft. No blade, no point, just the wood. He held it all night, and when morning came, he returned it to the priests and whispered, "I did not regret it." They did not strike him. They nodded. He was allowed to return to battle, but never again led a charge. Instead, he trained others, quietly, patiently, always beginning with the question, "What do you do when your enemy weeps?" Across the city, in a quieter district where the dye makers and basket weavers set up before the sun, a girl named Xochitl had been brought forward for a mistake woven not from hatred or arrogance, but from haste. She had misdyed a ritual garment. The robe was meant for the spring ceremony, its threads dedicated to Tlaltecutli, the earth deity. It was to be dyed deep red with cochineal, each fold bearing the mark of fertility and strength. But in her rush, eager to impress her elders, Xochitl had used the wrong mordant. The colour faded to rust. The garment turned brown beneath the sun. It was worn anyway. And the ceremony, though completed, was considered muted. The offerings were accepted, but the omens read afterward were unclear, clouded, fractured. The high priest's gaze fell upon the faded cloth. He said only 3 words, "Return the colour." Her punishment was the hue remembered. She was given no dye, no cloth, no thread, only a bowl of water, a brush of agave fibre, and a white wall facing east. Each morning, before the sun touched it, she was to paint upon the wall the colour she had meant to create, not with pigment, but with memory. She described it as she painted. Red like the inside of a fig, red like the blood from my own ear, red that tastes like metal and sounds like thunder. The brush left no mark, but her words lingered. Others began to gather in the mornings, just to hear. By the 7th day, the wall seemed to hold something, an echo, a shimmer in the rising light. On the 13th day, she was given cochineal again. This time, she crushed the insect slowly, sang as she stirred, and dyed the robe so deeply it seemed to pulse. The priests kept it, not for wear, for remembrance. Elsewhere, on the western edge of the city, a man named Ocelotl had been punished not for deed, but for gaze. He had watched a sacred rite from a hidden perch. The ceremony was for warriors recently fallen, a private offering held at dusk atop a hill not open to the common eye. Ocelotl, a potter, had followed out of curiosity, hiding among the rocks, watching as the priests sang and offered bone, blood, and obsidian dust to the setting sun. He told no one, but the gods knew. His punishment was the blind witness. For 5 days he was blindfolded and led through the city, not in shame, but in guidance. Each stop brought him to a place he had never seen. The cradle of a newborn child wrapped in wet cotton, the empty altar of a home recently burned, the silent interior of the temple kitchen where no voices were allowed. At each place, he was told to listen. He came to understand the difference between seeing and witnessing. On the 6th day, the blindfold was removed. His eyes were changed, not in colour, but in manner. Slower, more deliberate. And he returned to his pottery with a new symbol scratched into each bowl, a small eye closed, surrounded by ears. In Tenochtitlan, nothing was wasted. Not the flame of a warrior's regret. Not the faded cloth of a girl's mistake. Not the silence of a potter who saw too much. Every misstep was woven back into the world. Not smoothed, not hidden, but marked, honoured. And in those markings the city remembered how to breathe. The light of early dawn crept across the water like a whisper, soft and grey, barely brushing the tops of the floating chinampas before it reached the stone bones of Tenochtitlan. The city, though vast and vibrant in the noonday sun, in these earliest hours seemed wrapped in a kind of hush, a reverence not imposed by temple law, but grown from within its very rhythm. It was in this breath between darkness and fire that another soul was led to judgment, and another punishment was set to begin. His name was Tlahuicol, and he was a man of the shield, strong, quiet, unwavering in battle. He had earned the right to wear the eagle feathers across his shoulders, to march at the head of the procession during the feasts of Huitzilopochtli. His loyalty had never been questioned, his skill never doubted. It was not war that undid him, nor weakness, nor betrayal. It was mercy. Tlahuicol had spared a life on the battlefield. The campaign had been swift, a punitive raid against a rebellious outpost near the mountain's edge. His spear had found its mark, and his opponent fell, wounded, bleeding but alive. The man had dropped his weapon, whispered the name of his child, and closed his eyes. Tlahuicol stepped back. Others saw. They dragged the wounded man away, and Tlahuicol did not speak. But word spread, as it always did. Mercy was not forbidden among the Mexica, but it was regulated. A captured warrior must be taken with ritual. Their life must be claimed in accordance with the gods' hunger. To spare without offering, to hesitate without prayer, was to disrupt the order that war was meant to serve. The priesthood summoned him. He came without defense, his eyes downcast, not ashamed, only resigned. They gave him a sentence rarely spoken aloud. The blade turned inward. For 13 days he was forbidden to hold a weapon, not just in battle, at all. His spear was taken, his dagger sealed, even the obsidian blades of his meal knives replaced with dull bone. He was not allowed to spar, not allowed to train. He was to walk among the boys of the House of Youths, not as a master, but as an observer, watching as others repeated the drills he had perfected. And each evening he knelt in the courtyard of the god of war, facing a rack of weapons he could no longer touch. At the end of the 13th day, he was handed a single spear shaft, no blade, no point, just the wood. He held it all night, and when morning came, he returned it to the priests and whispered, "I did not regret it." They did not strike him. They nodded. He was allowed to return to battle, but never again led a charge. Instead, he trained others, quietly, patiently, always beginning with the question, "What do you do when your enemy weeps?" Across the city, in a quieter district where the dye makers and basket weavers set up before the sun, a girl named Xochitl had been brought forward for a mistake, woven not from hatred or arrogance, but from haste. She had misdyed a ritual garment. The robe was meant for the spring ceremony, its threads dedicated to Tlaltecutli, the earth deity. It was to be dyed deep red with cochineal, each fold bearing the mark of fertility and strength. But in her rush, eager to impress her elders, Xochitl had used the wrong mordant. The colour faded to rust. The garment turned brown beneath the sun. It was worn anyway. And the ceremony, though completed, was considered muted. The offerings were accepted, but the omens read afterward were unclear, clouded, fractured. The high priest's gaze fell upon the faded cloth. He said only 3 words, "Return the colour." Her punishment was the hue remembered. She was given no dye, no cloth, no thread. Only a bowl of water, a brush of agave fibre, and a white wall facing east. Each morning, before the sun touched it, she was to paint upon the wall the colour she had meant to create, not with pigment, but with memory. She described it as she painted, red like the inside of a fig, red like the blood from my own ear, red that tastes like metal and sounds like thunder. The brush left no mark, but her words lingered. Others began to gather in the mornings, just to hear. By the 7th day, the wall seemed to hold something, an echo, a shimmer in the rising light. On the 13th day, she was given cochineal again. This time, she crushed the insects slowly, sang as she stirred, and dyed the robe so deeply it seemed to pulse. The priests kept it, not for wear, for remembrance. Elsewhere, on the western edge of the city, a man named Ocelotl had been punished not for deed, but for gaze. He had watched a sacred rite from a hidden perch. The ceremony was for warriors recently fallen, a private offering held at dusk atop a hill not open to the common eye. Ocelotl, a potter, had followed out of curiosity, hiding among the rocks, watching as the priests sang and offered bone, blood, and obsidian dust to the setting sun. He told no one, but the gods knew. His punishment was the blind witness. For 5 days he was blindfolded and led through the city, not in shame, but in guidance. Each stop brought him to a place he had never seen, the cradle of a newborn child wrapped in wet cotton, the empty altar of a home recently burned, the silent interior of the temple kitchen where no voices were allowed. At each place he was told to listen. He came to understand the difference between seeing and witnessing. On the 6th day, the blindfold was removed. His eyes were changed, not in colour but in manner, slower, more deliberate. And he returned to his pottery with a new symbol scratched into each bowl, a small eye closed, surrounded by ears. In Tenochtitlan, nothing was wasted. Not the flame of a warrior's regret, not the faded cloth of a girl's mistake, not the silence of a potter who saw too much. Every misstep was woven back into the world, not smooth, not hidden, but marked, honoured. And in those markings the city remembered how to breathe. The wind off the lake had shifted. It carried with it the scent of charred wood and damp stone, the remnants of a small fire recently extinguished. It was not the smoke of destruction, but of ritual, controlled, ancient, and purposeful. Across Tenochtitlan, the people knew that this shift in the air meant the season of renewal was approaching. It was a time when errors, even small ones, could echo more loudly through the city's sacred corridors. In the southern fringe of the craftsman's quarter, a man named Teyakapan stood before the Temple of Tools. He was a maker of blades, obsidian edges so fine they could part skin without pain, slice feathers from bone with no sound. His creations had been used in war, in offerings, in sacred surgery. His hands were calloused, his fingers always blackened with dust from the stones he worked. But he had sold one of his blades to the wrong hands. A young man, barely past the rites of adulthood, drunk on pulque and swollen pride, had begged Teyakapan for a dagger, claiming it was for a festival rite. Teyakapan, distracted, obliged without the usual questions. 3 nights later, the young man used the blade in a brawl, slashing the leg of another boy in the marketplace. The wound was not fatal, but the weapon bore Teyakapan's mark. The priest summoned him. He brought the rest of his tools in a bundle of reed, offered them without word, and awaited judgment. His punishment was the edge within. He was given a stone, the same weight and shape as those he shaped daily, but unbreakable. He was to carry it with him at all times, bound to his wrist by a thread dyed with cochineal. For 13 days he could not create, could not shape or grind or smooth. Instead, he was to reflect. Each night he sat in the courtyard of the artisans, surrounded by the sounds of others at work. He listened to the scrape of metal, the crack of wood, the drip of paint. But he made nothing. On the 13th night, a small boy approached him, barefoot, holding a reed flute broken in half. "Can you fix it?" the child asked. Teyakapan looked at the stone on his wrist. Then slowly he untied it. He ground the stone against itself until it cracked, then used a shard to carve the broken flute's edges. He fitted them together, sealed the crack with resin from a nearby fig tree. The child played a single note, then smiled. Teyakapan stood, returned to the temple, and left the broken stone on the steps. His blades were returned the next day. He sharpened them with slower hands. And across the lake, in the island village of Mixquick, where the dead were honoured with marigold paths and songs sung beneath glowing skulls, a woman named Amoxocheetl was judged for a ritual she had performed too early. It had been the 7th day after her mother's passing. The priests had instructed her to wait until the 13th night to set the offering fire. But grief does not wait. Grief moves on its own clock. She had lit the copal and bone charcoal ahead of the moon's cue, and in doing so, she risked calling her mother's spirit back before it was ready to rest. The penalty was not severe, but it was necessary. She was given the waiting flame. Each night, she was instructed to light a new fire, small, steady, then sit beside it until it burned to ash. No prayers, no songs, only the fire and her breath. She did this faithfully, her eyes fixed not on the flame but on the space above it. By the 8th night she swore she saw the shape of her mother's hands in the smoke. By the 12th she no longer wept. On the 13th night the priestess came. Together they watched the flame die. And this time her offering was accepted. Not far from there, in a noble house lined with turquoise mosaics and embroidered hangings, a young acolyte named Ehekatl was brought forward. Not for sin, but for a failure to listen. He had interrupted his teacher during a recitation of the sacred calendar, inserting his own interpretation of a lunar omen before the passage was complete. It was not arrogance, the priest noted. It was eagerness. But even eagerness, unchecked, could fray the sacred threads of speech. He was sentenced to the breath held. For one cycle of the stars, he was allowed to speak only after a breath had been drawn and held to its limit. Each word had to follow stillness. At first, he struggled. His sentences came haltingly, breathless, but over time, his voice slowed. His thoughts arranged themselves before the air was gone. By the end, his teacher asked him to recite the same passage he had interrupted. He did so with such pause and care that even the guards outside the chamber leaned in to listen. His name, once spoken quickly like wind, became a title of patience. In the deepest heart of Tenochtitlan, where the temple walls bore the weight of centuries, another tale was whispered, of a boy who had carved a god's symbol into a tree. He had meant no harm. He wanted the god to live near him, to guard his dreams. but the symbol was sacred, not to be placed where birds defecated and dogs rubbed their backs. His punishment was gentle. He was asked to dig a small hole beside the tree, whisper an apology into the soil, and plant maize. The maize grew tall, and the god, it seemed, accepted. For in Tenochtitlan, the line between mistake and offering was thin, and punishment, when bound to reflection, was never about erasure. It was about growing toward the light, even after the cut. The evening air curled gently through the temple courtyards, bringing with it the warm scent of roasted maize, drying agave, and the faint metallic tang of obsidian dust. Shadows lengthened across the stone walkways, pooling at the base of walls carved with centuries of memory. Tenochtitlan, though vast and filled with thousands of souls, moved softly in this hour, as if the city itself were listening. And somewhere within the hush, a punishment unfolded, not from crime, but from confusion. In the quarters of the woodcarvers, a boy named Nenetl had presented a mask to the temple, a gift for the festival of Shipe Totec, the flayed god of renewal and spring. It was his first offering as an apprentice, carved from cypress, painted with ochre and lime. The mask bore large eyes and a curved mouth, open as if in chant. It was carefully polished, the grains smoothed with riverstone, the edges bound with dyed twine. But when the priests examined it, they fell silent. He had placed the symbol of Ehecatl, the wind god, upon the brow. It was not defiance. It was not ignorance. It was a boy's misunderstanding of the many faces of gods, how one spirit might hold the rain while another carried the wind, and yet another wore the skin of sacrifice to remind the people of rebirth. The priests called it a breach in sacred alignment. His punishment was not to burn the mask, it was to understand it. They sentenced him to the path of the maskless. For 13 days, Nenetl was not allowed to look upon any carved face. No masks, no idols, no effigies in marketplace stalls. Not even the painted visages on pottery or the sculpted guardians atop doorposts. His home was covered, his path guided by an older apprentice who led him blindfolded past every temptation. Instead, he was made to listen. Each day, a different priest or elder told him the story of a god, not in image, but in breath. Their voices painted what his eyes could not see. Tezcatlipoca's mirror that reflected the soul's cracks, Coyolxauhqui's broken body spread across the stars, Tlaloc's tears turning to lakes. Nenetl began to carry these shapes within him. On the 14th day, he was given back his mask. He looked upon it for a long time before speaking. Then he painted over the mistaken glyph, not to hide it, but to layer it with another, transforming the error into a double meaning, one sacred to both wind and rebirth. The priests nodded, and his mask was accepted into the temple. Across the causeway in the flower district, where the scent of xochitl blossoms hung thick in the air and hummingbirds darted between vines like spirits with wings, an older woman named Ayao had committed an offence less visual, but no less severe. She had offered prayers in the wrong language, not the wrong words, not the wrong tone, but the tongue of a neighbouring people, phrases remembered from her grandmother who had come from the hills beyond the valley. She had prayed at dawn in Mixtec, asking for the safe return of her son, a warrior long overdue from a coastal campaign. A young priest overheard her, and though he did not mock her, he reported the breach. The gods, it was said, needed clarity. Language shaped the ritual vessel. Mixing tongues could confuse the spirits or invite the wrong ones. Ayao was summoned to explain herself. She did not weep, she did not defend. She only said, "The words came from my blood." Her punishment was named the weaving of breath. Each morning she was given a spindle of cotton thread and a mat of woven reeds. She was to speak her prayers aloud in her grandmother's tongue while threading, but with each phrase she had to tie a knot and explain its meaning in Nahuatl. The act was not correction. It was translation born of reverence. Priests sat nearby and listened, not judging but learning. By the 6th day others joined her, young girls whose families had also come from elsewhere, old men who had forgotten their birth languages until her voice brought them back. By the 13th day the mat was full of knots, each one a story, a prayer, a bridge between lands. The priests placed it in the temple beside the codices and renamed the rite Tlahuica Nenetl, the breath that holds. From then on, one prayer per season was spoken in another tongue, chosen not for novelty but for remembrance. And so the gods, it was believed, heard more than one voice. In the northern watchtowers, where soldiers drilled under the eye of obsidian-plated captains, another reckoning stirred, this time not of speech or symbol, but of inaction. A sentinel named Ixopan had failed to light the signal torch. A trader had arrived after dusk from the East Road, claiming to have seen foreign canoes near the lake's bend. The proper response was to ignite a torch in the tower, a red flame signalling readiness. But Ixopan, weary and doubtful, delayed. The canoes were only fishermen, it turned out. No threat, but the torch had not burned, and readiness had failed. His punishment was called the Flame Without Fire. For 20 nights, he stood in the tower with a clay torch in hand, shaped like the real ones, but unlit and hollow. Each night, as others marched and trained, he stood motionless, watching the lake, waiting. And on the 21st night, a real torch was handed to him. He lit it instantly, unbidden, and held it aloft. There were no invaders. No need, but the city slept easier. For they had seen the flame, and remembered that watching was also a prayer. Thus, Tenochtitlan continued to guide its people, not through fear, not through blood alone, but through shaping. Mistakes were not buried. They were carried, examined, transformed. For in the empire of the Mexica, even error had its god. The clouds over Lake Texcoco hung low that week, their bellies swollen with water and wind, like gods brooding above a city too still to speak. Tenochtitlan, wrapped in fog, moved more slowly beneath their shadow. Temple bells rang softer. Market chants echoed less. Even the birds changed their songs to a quieter tune. And within this hush, another punishment was prepared. Not loud or cruel, but winding and strange, like the mist that curled between the pillars of the old shrines. In the western garden of the Healers district, there lived a woman named Cozamalolotl, whose breath was said to carry the warmth of flowering fields. Her home was a refuge for the weary, a place where warriors brought their bruises, and women came to deliver children beneath nets strung with feathers and dried marigolds. Her hands were careful, her voice patient. But even she was not above the soft, persistent reach of judgment. She had sung a sacred lullaby on the wrong day. The song, known as Tlazocamati, was reserved for the 7th night after a child's birth, when the stars were thought to tilt in favor of long life, and the soul was anchored more firmly into flesh. But Cozamalotl had sung it too early, her voice drifting through the reeds on the 5th night, as a fevered child gasped in a hut near the water's edge. The boy lived. The family wept with gratitude, but the priesthood did not smile. Ritual was a woven cloth. To pull even one thread early was to risk unraveling it. Cozamalotl was summoned, not in shame, but in ritual curiosity. Her punishment was called the Song That Waits. She was instructed to sing nothing for a full cycle of the moon. Not a chant, not a hum, not even a whispered phrase in the rhythm of breath. Instead, each morning she was to walk to the temple of Xochiquetzal, the goddess of beauty and fertility, and sit beneath the fruited tree in the courtyard. There she was to hold a bowl of water on her lap and watch the wind ripple its surface. Each ripple was a breath she could not take in song, each stillness a measure of silence. At first, the silence felt like a weight on her chest. Her lips ached to part. Her hands, used to tapping rhythm as she worked, fell idle. But slowly the city itself began to sing to her, the rustle of the fronds, the call of mourning doves, the footfalls of children skipping past the temple steps. On the 28th day, a newborn was placed in her arms. She did not sing, she waited, and at the rise of the 2nd moon, she opened her mouth and let out a single note, clear, slow, aching with patience. The child smiled. Her song had returned, and with it, the balance. In another corner of the city, under the painted eaves of the old dancers' school, a boy named Huitzilihuitl faced a punishment far quieter and far stranger. He had dreamt of a god and told no one. In his vision, Quetzalcoatl had come to him, wearing not feathers but a cloak of dust and tears. The god had not spoken but had wept, kneeling beside a broken clay flute. When the boy awoke, he had remembered every detail, the bend of the serpent tail, the glint of copper in the eye, but he had told no priest, no elder. He had drawn it instead, on his sleeping mat, on the wall of the school's inner corridor, and then, most dangerously, into the wet clay of the temple's storage jar, where offerings for the feathered god were placed. It was discovered when the clay dried. The image, though crude, was unmistakable. Dreams were not forbidden, but hiding them was. His punishment was the dream unbound. For 7 nights he was to sleep within the open temple courtyard, under the eye of the stars, where all dreams were thought to be closer to the god's breath. And each morning he had to paint what he saw in sleep, not in secret, not alone, but before the priests and acolytes. Some mornings he painted feathers falling through water. Other days he drew only spirals or hands reaching into the mouths of fish. On the 6th morning he painted nothing. "I did not dream," he said. The priest simply nodded. On the 7th he painted the god again, this time not weeping but planting a seed. The punishment ended, but the boy continued to sleep outside, and his drawings were kept. The priests whispered of a new form of seeing. In the quarter of copper workers, where fires never fully died and the air was always thick with heat and metal's ghost, a young girl named Tlazotzin burned her finger on purpose. It was not a dramatic act. A small coal had slipped near the foot of her father's anvil, and as he turned, she pressed her fingertip into it. The pain was brief, the scar small. When asked why, she said, "I wanted to feel what he feels." Her father wept when he heard. He had never complained of the burns. But pain was not a right for children. She was taken to the temple of Chalchiuhtlicue, goddess of lakes and rivers. Her punishment was the water that heals without fire. Each morning for 10 days she was to submerge her hands in lake water at dawn, and then touch 10 plants, each one sacred to a different goddess, not to crush, not to gather, only to feel. The coolness slowly unravelled the heat within her. By the 10th day the scar had faded. Her father gave her a gift, not a tool, but a bowl shaped like a hand, to remind her that feeling could shape, but also hold. Thus, in the quiet shadows of the temples, in the reeds near the lake, in the lull between storms and offerings, Tenochtitlan continued its long, slow weaving of judgment. Not to punish, but to restore. The last light of dusk fell slowly across the causeways, stretching long fingers of gold and umber into the heart of Tenochtitlan. The temples no longer blazed in white, they glowed warm, almost breathing. From every district of fishers, scribes, warriors, weavers, the sound of preparation began to ebb. Night was near. The season was nearly closed, and with it came the final story of reckoning, quiet as a falling feather, deep as the lake's cold bed. It was not a crime of action, nor of words, nor even of omission. It was something smaller, almost invisible, and yet it had been noticed. A boy named Ehekatzin had not looked up during prayer. He was young, still learning the gestures, the chants, the rhythm of sacred posture. But as the people lifted their faces to the heavens during the solar blessing, his eyes remained lowered, his chin tucked, a mistake, a habit, or something deeper. No priest scolded him, no elder struck his wrist. Instead, they observed. The next day, it happened again. He bowed when he should have gazed. The 3rd day, the offering was halted mid-chant, and the high priest walked to him, not with anger, but with the gravity of someone who had walked these steps many times. "Why do you not look?" he asked. Ehekatzin answered softly, "The sun is too bright, and I am too small." Not defiance, not shame, only honesty. And in that honesty the priest found not disrespect, but a lesson waiting to be shaped. His punishment was the gaze reflected. He was led to the temple pool, a deep, still basin used only during the solar rites, where obsidian stones lined the bottom and the stars were known to appear even in daylight. Each morning for 13 days, Ehekatzin sat at its edge. He was told not to look at the sky, only the water. There he could see the sun without blindness, the clouds drifting, the birds tracing circles. But most of all, he saw himself, reflected back again and again, rippling with the light. The priests would sometimes ask what he saw. "Fire moving in circles," he said once. "My mother's face waiting," another time. And on the 13th morning he whispered, "A god who does not blink." That evening he was brought back to the altar, and when the chant rose and the people lifted their faces to the sky, Ehekatzin looked too, not because he was forced, but because he had been taught to see differently. Elsewhere, in a garden that belonged to no district but sat between the paths of 4, a place where no family lived, but many came to remember, an old woman named Teikui had gathered herbs she was not permitted to touch. They were mourning herbs meant for the dead. But she had harvested them for a living friend, an old companion now ill and fading. The priests found her washing them in silence, laying them on white cloth, and humming a melody reserved for the burial of nobles. When asked, she simply said, "He is not dead yet, but I want him to feel remembered." It was not a grave offence, but the timing of rites mattered. Her punishment was the offering in waiting. She was asked to prepare the same herbs each day, but not for the living and not for the dead, for the in-between. Each morning she left the bundle on the edge of the garden, where those grieving but not yet mourning might find them, those with parents drifting, those with lovers slipping into shadow. And slowly word spread. People began to leave small tokens beside her herbs, beads, feathers, half-spoken names. She never claimed them, never kept them, only watched as the offerings grew. And one morning her friend died. She placed the same herbs upon his chest, with no tears, only breath. The priests did not intervene. Some silences are sacred. In the final hours of the season, when even the wind seemed to pass through the city more gently, the high temple opened its inner chamber, not for sacrifice, not for vision, but for memory. There, one by one, the keepers of punishment placed tokens from each judgment. The cracked clay flute of the dreamer, the dyed thread of the woman who remembered another tongue, the dull blade of the maker who had forgotten to ask, the cord of silence, knotted with truths. And last, a single bowl of still water, placed by a boy now standing taller, who no longer lowered his eyes. These were not trophies, they were reminders. That in Tenochtitlan justice was not a blade but a mirror, not a lash but a ritual, not an end but a way back, a way to walk again, not unchanged but seen. And as the final smoke of copal rose into the night sky, carried by voices no longer trembling, the city exhaled. Its gods watched, not with wrath but with patience. And in every punishment endured, another thread was pulled back into the fabric of balance, quiet and steady, as stars blinked awake over the lake.